Imagine you're the richest merchant in the world, but a blade is pressed against your throat. A demonic cult has slaughtered your entire guild for a single divine pill. Will you beg for mercy or hand over all your wealth? No. The hero simply bites into the legendary pill, right in front of the enemy's nose. The enraged assassin decapitates him with a single swing, and with a scream, the guy wakes up in bed 30 years ago. His head is still on his shoulders, and he's once again a 17-year-old penniless apprentice of the Udon clan. Right in front of him, a game shop for in-game purchases pops up in midair. The cheater's agility skill costs just 3 copper coins. The ingenious merchant immediately sells him a herbal whistle. He gets the coins and buys the skill. His goal is to get kicked out of the sect in a scandal and build a trading empire. At the tournament, he throws sand in his opponent's eyes and knocks him out with a punch to the jaw. Instead of expelling him, the elders declare him a hidden genius. As punishment, he's forced to climb the cliffs, carrying a huge sack of mail. At night, in complete darkness, and blindfolded, the system hands him a glowing cheat card right through the blindfold, and he blindly masters the legendary Steps of the Blue Clouds. And so, an ordinary merchant with no talent begins to outplay the entire martial arts world. Watch until the end to find out if this genius merchant can become richer than all the gods of Murim. The story begins with the Hui Yan Trading Guild, which was officially considered the richest and most powerful force in the entire Central Plains. Until that night, the estate remained as it had always been, until it burned to the ground. What happened was no accident. It was a brutal and premeditated attack by a terrifying demonic cult. Having cornered the bleeding guild leader, the masked executioners froze, and their leader casually remarked that for an ordinary merchant, he had an all-too-irritating sense of justice. The villain demanded the key to a secure wooden box lying on the floor, but the merchant merely smirked in response, asking if they thought he was an idiot. With contempt, the guild leader added that the cultists themselves were the real brainless clowns, since the box couldn't be opened without the key, and any attempt to break into it would instantly destroy its contents. Tired of empty talk, the cult leader made his eye flare with a terrifying hypnotic pink energy. It was high-level mind control sorcery, and the poor merchant immediately felt immense pressure. The poor man's jaw trembled, moving against his will, and he struggled to blurt out that the key was hidden right under his chair. With a lazy wave of his hand, the leader signaled to his servant, and the servant instantly dug a gleaming brass key out of the rubble. After examining the locked chest, the leader realized that even with the key, the mechanical trap inside was too complex to bypass. Turning to the paralyzed hero and holding up the key, he mockingly offered to do him the honor and open the box himself, since he'd already given everything away anyway. Using dark magic, the villain forced the merchant's hands to grab the key and insert it into the lock. Screaming in frustration, the hero cursed the useless head of the Martial Arts Alliance, who had sworn that this box was completely protected from any thieves. As it turned out, ancient high-tech security systems are completely useless when the thief happens to be a sorcerer. The lock clicked, and a dazzling bright blue light burst forth from the silk lining. Inside lay just one legendary pill, and the young man felt sick at the realization that the cult had slaughtered his entire guild just to find the cure. The masked assassin immediately pressed his blade right against the protagonist's throat, and while the pill still glowed before them, he asked, "Did the guild leader have any last words?" The guild leader immediately tried to bribe him with money to save his own skin, but the assassin made it clear right away that he cared only about the cult's interests. Then the glow intensified sharply, and the assassin stared ahead in shock. The guildmaster merely smirked, revealing a glowing blue sphere hidden in his mouth. Clenching his jaw, the merchant bit into the legendary pill, which caused a wild crackle of electrical energy. Faced with such audacity, the attacker completely lost his composure and, in a panic, swung his sword, cleaving the young man's head clean off his shoulders. The severed head flew into the air and then bounced several times across the wooden floor, flashing us the head's smirk. Suddenly, the echo of a deafening scream pierced the silence of the Udan clan's mountains, and the poor fellow woke up with a wild scream in his cozy bed, frantically clutching his neck and checking to see if his head was still there. Lying fully clothed, he looked around and remembered that that bastard had definitely cut off his head. The door to the hero's bedroom swung wide open, and a stern, middle-aged man entered, holding a huge bamboo staff in his hands. The mentor addressed the hero and began to protest loudly, indignant that a lazy, worldly student dared to sleep so late. The young man looked up and his mind literally froze in shock at the sight of the enraged old man. Standing before him was the Taoist master Chung Yun, his old instructor from the distant past. Before the poor fellow could even process what was happening, the master delivered a lightning-fast blow straight to his skull. Falling to the floor and rubbing his head, the young man tried to figure out what kind of dream this was. After all, more than 30 years had passed since he'd been a low-ranking secular disciple here, and he clearly remembered being expelled shortly after that evaluation. However, something even more insane and inexplicable happened next. Right in front of his face, a giant glowing bamboo scroll hovered in the air. It resembled traditional bamboo slats, hovering silently in the middle of the room. The instructor walked right through it, completely oblivious, which proved that only the protagonist was able to see this object. Looking closely at the floating text, the young man realized that he was standing before a real-life in-game store for system purchases. They offered insane, godlike abilities, such as clairvoyance and a special skeletal structure, but the prices were downright extortionate. And yet, amid all of this, an offer for beginners caught my eye. The agile movement skill was being sold for just 3 copper coins. Glancing at his furious teacher and putting on the most innocent expression he could muster, the student asked if he could borrow exactly 3 copper coins from him. A vein on the mentor's forehead nearly burst with rage, and he delivered yet another powerful blow, the echo of which reverberated throughout the mountain. A few days passed, and the hero was already sitting on the street under a clear blue sky, chewing on a blade of grass and having finally come to terms with his new reality. Fate had officially transported him 30 years back in time, returning him to his aimless youth. The name of that glowing blue pill he had swallowed came to mind: the Divine Demon Pill. Since the potion had ripped his soul from his dying body and hurled him back 30 years, it clearly possessed incredible power. But as the young man pondered, a brilliant and simple realization dawned on him. If in this timeline he simply avoided taking that stupid pill, the demonic cult would have absolutely no reason to burn down his future guild. He didn't have to exhaust himself with martial arts at all. All he had to do was use his knowledge of the future to become the richest merchant in history. His musings were interrupted by a cheerful classmate who approached him with a question: why he was choosing to skip class on test day. The merchant squinted, trying to remember his name. Ah yes, that's right, Jian Osu. This guy was the heir to the massive Wuhan banking clan, and was essentially a walking cheat code among his friends. Osu pointed to 2 other students practicing so-called Tai Chi on stage, which the hero privately described as 2 little kids fighting over a juice packet, not a martial art. In response, the protagonist showed Osu a handful of freshly cut herbal whistles, and outlined his brilliant business plan involving elite inner circle students, who were nothing but spoiled brats who had done nothing but swing swords since birth. The guy said they were guaranteed to go wild with excitement at the sight of a cool homemade toy. Osu was genuinely impressed by such entrepreneurial spirit, and to test the product in action, he put the grass whistle to his lips and coaxed a beautiful melody from it. He liked the instrument so much that he immediately tossed 3 copper coins, buying one for himself. After saying goodbye, Osu left, leaving the young man with exactly the amount needed for the purchase. With a greedy smirk on his face, the merchant picked up the 3 shiny copper coins. Summoning a floating bamboo plank, he focused on the skill of nimble movement. The coins in his hands suddenly dissolved into a cloud of sparkling gold dust. A system message flashed, confirming the successful completion of the purchase. Clenching his fist, the young man expected an incredible surge of power. But to be honest, he didn't feel anything new. Before he had a chance to get upset that the bamboo tablet had deceived him, a loud shout rang out from the courtyard. One of the elite inner disciples had grabbed a lay disciple's wrist, twisting it painfully. It was the arrogant boy Myung-gyong, throwing a tantrum and screaming as if this loser's terrible Tai Chi were an insult to the entire sect. The poor disciple was filled with rage and decided to punish the little scoundrel. But the boy merely sneered with contempt and swung his arm. In a split second, he was right next to him, intending to snap the older guy's arm like a dry twig. The older student was shocked by the brat's speed, and the attacker taunted him, asking if some worldly loser seriously expected to stand up to an elite inner disciple. Suddenly, a shadow glided across the ground, moving at an incredible supernatural speed. The protagonist deftly slipped through the boy's defense and gently placed a hand on his shoulder. Folding his hands in a respectful greeting, he introduced himself as Muk Hui Myung. With the warm, polite smile of a professional salesman, the young man asked the petty tormentor to let his friend go first. The little brat glared at him fiercely, seething with irritation at being interrupted. He told Myung that he could talk all he wanted, but only after he finished breaking that arm. The hero's smile didn't waver for a second. He said he didn't care either way. Leaning in closer and flashing a look of pure merchant greed, the young man asked if he'd rather appraise an exclusive, premium product instead. The scene changed. The bright sun shone over the Udon Mountains when a piercing whistle cut through the air. High on the cliff, a figure in elegant blue robes turned, drawn by the sound. The stranger took a step forward, and his boots tapped softly on the stone path. He looked down at the courtyard, watching the gathering of secular students. Meanwhile, down below, the piercing melody of the grass whistle continued to ring out. The main character, Hui Yang, blew into the leaf, realizing that playing as well as Osu was quite difficult, but his terrible performance was more than enough to captivate the children standing before him. Myung and his friends stared at him with wide, shining eyes. The little boy had let go of the other student's hand long ago and was now practically begging to be allowed to try. Hui Yang put the sheet of paper away, declaring that as soon as the whistle touched someone's lips, it would lose its premium value. However, flashing everyone a dazzling smile, he held up a brand new, untouched whistle. The merchant announced that the standard retail price was 5 copper nyans. But since he was feeling generous today, he would sell it at a bargain price. Just 3. The children's excited faces immediately clouded over, giving way to awkward, embarrassed expressions. Shviyan's smile faded, as his inner business radar sensed a catch in their reaction. Hoping to close the deal, he hastily offered a special discount for bulk purchases. However, Myung lowered his gaze, fidgeting with his fingers, and mumbled that they didn't have any money on them. The other children whined, asking if they could buy the whistles on credit or trade them for something else. Huyang sighed heavily and silently, realizing that children who had grown up in the remote mountains naturally had no pocket money. Glancing at the elite students training nearby, the boy reminded himself of his true goal. He had no use for their pitiful coins. He was eager to forge ties with the future leaders of the sect. With a solemn and respectful air, he presented Myung with a grass whistle as a gift. The hero assured the boy that it was a tremendous honor for him to present such a gift to such a brilliant student of the main branch of the Udon clan. The child's chest swelled with pride, and he gratefully accepted the toy. Hui Yang smirked to himself, recalling that in his past life, this little tyke had grown up to become the invincible Taiji sword. To secure the favor of the future greatest master for the price of a single blade of grass? It was truly the deal of the century. But suddenly, the sword slid out of its sheath and flashed. Suddenly, the sharpest blade of a sword flashed through the air, freezing just millimeters from Hui Yang's throat. A cold and furious voice demanded an answer. Who he was and why he was fooling the young disciples with cheap tricks. Looking at the long-haired master standing behind the children, Hui Yang grumbled to himself that these martial arts masters were quick to reach for their weapons at the slightest provocation. But then he realized that this was the master of those children from the central pavilion. Myung dropped his whistle, trembling and on the verge of tears from the sudden, terrifying tension. Hui Yang clenched his teeth, annoyed that these bone crushers considered everything except sword-wielding to be trash. Stepping back casually and folding his arms across his chest, the young man asked whether enjoying a simple, peaceful melody had become a crime in Udon. The master's eyes narrowed dangerously, and he asked what some worldly disciple had just dared to say to him. In response, Hui Yang spoke in ancient poetic metaphors, comparing the mind to an archer aiming at a target. He noted that the target never moves, and it is only the archer's wavering mind that hesitates. Looking the master straight in the eye, the young man asked whether a simple grass whistle was really enough to shake the concentration of a true master. A breeze swept through the courtyard. The master stared silently at a blade of grass that had fallen onto the stone floor. Then his face grew increasingly grim, frightening the protagonist, until a roaring blue aura burst from his body with an explosion. The weight of the pressure squeezed the air in the courtyard as the master asked if Hui Yang was mocking the Udon clan. Hui Yang felt a knot tighten inside him, but his sharp mind kept him on his feet. He knew that the Udon clan was a righteous sect, and no matter how angry they might be, they wouldn't kill a child over a blade of grass. Folding his hands together, he bowed deeply, overcoming the oppressive aura. He declared that even if the fiercest storm raged, a tree cannot simply step out of its path. The young man added that he would press forward, praying that his resolve would not falter. The oppressive aura instantly vanished, and the master burst into loud, cheerful laughter. He praised Hui Yang's incredible resilience for withstanding the pressure of his aura. Reaching into his bosom, the master declared the herbal whistles to be excellent entertainment and offered to buy all 15 of them. Hui Yang's eyes immediately lit up with the prospect of profit, and he cheerfully named a total price of 75 copper neons. When the master asked about the promised wholesale discount, Hui Yang shamelessly replied that discounts were available exclusively to minors. The master smirked at such brazen greed, calling him a ridiculous little boy, and pulled out a brand new paper receipt. Handing over a bank check for 100 neons, he ordered that the change be kept as compensation for the scare. Hui Yang happily pocketed the money, while the young apprentices in the background began whistling enthusiastically on their whistles. The merchant politely inquired after the master's Taoist name, realizing it was worth knowing the benefactor who had financed his next upgrade. The handsome master smiled gently and gave his name, Xiang Hua. Behind him, an epic title flashed, Divine Sword of Infinity. At that moment, he was among the top 5 strongest masters of the Udon clan, and was destined to become a titan of the martial arts world. Hui Yang's jaw dropped, and he instantly switched to hyper-polite mode, bowing frantically and fawning. Xiang Hua smirked, asking if the insolent boy had finally realized who he was being insolent to. Without looking up, the boy calmly replied that while Udon might follow noble paths, a merchant must always follow the path of trade. Xiang Hua grinned, genuinely amused by this shameless child. With a wave of his hand, he walked away with his disciples, laughing at the fact that the boys simply had to have the last word. Hui Yang let out a heavy sigh of relief, wiping the cold sweat from his forehead. Another secular disciple ran up to him, praising him for having dared to defy the legendary master and still survived. And the protagonist's smile vanished instantly as soon as a huge shadow loomed over him, and a thunderous voice called out his name. Turning around, the hero saw a burly, bald bully staring at him with a predatory smirk. It was Seigen Hyun, the worst scum among the secular disciples, and the very scoundrel who had gotten the hero expelled in his past life. So, the bald con artist had decided to show his face after all. Seigen Hyun stepped forward with the air of a cheap raid boss and asked the protagonist his name again, asking if the guy was connected to any influential patron. Putting on the most innocent expression he could muster, Hui Yang replied that he was just a simple guy from an ordinary peasant family. The bully immediately lost all respect for him and flashed a smug grin that was just begging to be punched. He held out his hand for a supposedly friendly deal, which was really just an old-fashioned version of a protection fee. One glance at that palm was enough. It was the hand of a man who had never worked an honest day in his life. The protagonist remembered that very hand all too well. In his past life, he had shaken it because he was young, desperate, and had no one to turn to. Back then, it had seemed like the opportunity of a lifetime. Until the worst day of his youth arrived. The strict instructor, Zhang Yun, burst into the courtyard carrying a suspicious black bag and dumped a whole mountain of highly questionable erotic pictures onto the floor. All the students in the crowd immediately began whispering about it. Hui Yang knew exactly who owned that collection. It belonged to the bald bully standing right next to him. The guy had once even refused to let anyone look at them. So Hui Yang initially thought it was karma, until the teacher pointed a finger at him, announcing that the pictures had been found in his room. The bald trickster stood behind him, whistling quietly while Hui Yang was in a panic. The instructor wasn't interested in explanations, and he immediately expelled the hero, ruining his life and condemning him to starvation. For years, because of that setup, the hero had to struggle in the mud. So when the bully reached out his hand again in the present, Hui Yang knocked it away with a sharp clang and great relish. Looking his enemies straight in the eye, he declared that the proposed deal was complete garbage. The bully was taken aback. The young man asked if playing King of the Hill really made him feel special just because he knew a couple of moves. He revealed the truth that the bully's father was just a petty, insignificant cult leader, that his coolness was all an act, and finally advised the bald guy to grow up. The bully took a step forward, dragging his boots across the stone. Coming right up close to Hui Yang's face, he hissed that the latter apparently had a deadly desire to speak in that tone. Hui Yang merely rewarded him with the most disrespectful and smug smirk. The guy suggested they just fight right there and get kicked out of here together. The bully realized he couldn't win this argument, since his opponent couldn't care less about staying in the sect. He backed off, half-heartedly warning him to watch his back. The attacker walked away, looking extremely annoyed, while Hui Young was even disappointed that he hadn't managed to provoke a fight that would lead to his quick expulsion. The guy ran through the timeline in his head. In his past life, his expulsion had happened a month later, but now he wanted to speed up his departure. Since getting kicked out for a fight hadn't worked out, he had to find a creative way to fail the upcoming exam. Osu's friend, who had run up to him, looked extremely worried. He asked what Hui Yang was going to do if a random matchup in the tournament pitted him against that huge, bald bully. Looking completely relaxed, the guy shrugged, replying that he'd deal with it as problems arose. However, deep down, the hero remembered the tournament bracket perfectly well, since he'd already been through this before. In the original, his opponent was a petty henchman of the bully who had beaten him half to death. If nothing changed, he could just take the hit, feign a pitiful defeat, and calmly leave the mountain. Just in case, he stashed away a secret weapon. The scene shifted back to the courtyard in the evening. The lanterns were lit, and the test began. The secular students in the courtyard exchanged extremely slow and lackluster blows. Instructor Cheng Yun looked as if he wished he were anywhere else on the planet. Suddenly, a voice behind him noted that the session had begun. It turned out to be Cheng Hua, the legendary master, who had stopped by to take a look at the new recruits. Cheng Yun sighed and replied that not a single one of these kids was worth even a second of his attention. Cheng Hua asked if the matches were truly random, and the instructor admitted that he had tweaked the bracket slightly behind the scenes. Glancing down from the balcony, Chen Hua spotted the main character, resting off to the side and casually chewing on a blade of grass while the others were drenched in sweat. Folding his arms, the master hatched a very dangerous plan in his mind. He asked the instructor if he could change the next match, and Cheng Yun blindly agreed to let him do whatever he wanted. Osu feigned interest while standing next to Hui Yan, who was simply waiting for the announcement of his swift defeat. The instructor called out the next pair, naming Mu Hui Yan. Waving to Osu, Hui Yan promised to return immediately after his quick loss. He walked down the steps, fully confident that he was about to gain his freedom. But the instructor announced that his opponent would be Sagan Hyun. Hui Yan froze. Looking up at the balcony, the young man saw Xiang Hua staring down at him with the most cheerful and malicious smirk. This guy had clearly rigged the bracket just for fun. The instructor immediately shouted the command to start the fight. The bully broke into a broad grin, like a child at a party, deciding that his prey had fallen right into his hands. He charged forward like a freight train, shouting that the guy should have looked over his shoulder. Leaping forward, he aimed his massive fist straight at Hui Yan's head. Hui Yan barely managed to dodge backward, realizing that his perfect peace plan had failed spectacularly. But for an experienced merchant, a change in circumstances simply meant a change in strategy. Clutching the small bag in his fist, he flung a handful of sand straight into his attacker's eyes. The bully screamed in pain and from the sand in his eyes. The entire balcony fell silent at such audacity. The head instructor and even the protagonist's friend were completely shocked by this turn of events. Hui Yan, however, didn't waste a second. He stepped forward with a broad smile, ready to finish what he'd started. The bully swung his arms blindly, but the young man easily ducked under his heavy blow. Using the basic three calamities style, he landed a clean, heavy blow right under his opponent's chin. This was followed by a second blow to the face, which completely knocked his opponent off balance. However, at the moment of impact, Hui Yan felt something strange in his own body. It felt incredibly light. Before he could even process it, a huge, grasping hand clamped down on his wrist with a death grip, and in the next instant, the bully threw him forcefully onto the stone floor. Hui Yan groaned, realizing he'd gotten carried away and stayed too close for too long. Wiping the blood from his mouth, the attacker was literally burning with pure rage. He threatened to finish the boy off right there, and Hui Yan realized he had misjudged the level of danger. The bully stood over him, covered in dust and blood, looking like a raging Hulk. The protagonist was still lying on the floor, grinning, knowing full well that he had broken absolutely every rule of the noble martial arts. On the balcony, instructor Jang Yun was losing his temper, screaming about dirty and dishonest moves. He was about to jump down and personally stop the fight, but someone's hand held him back. It was Cheng Hua, who looked completely unperturbed in the face of this sand-based strategy. He asked him to just sit back and watch a little longer. The master noted that the young man seemed to have a very specific plan in mind. Below, the bully swung his leg for a powerful kick, aimed straight at Hui Yan's ribs. Hui Yan leaped aside just in time as the enemy's boot smashed the stone tiles. As he dropped into a low stance, the hero could feel his heart pounding wildly in his chest. The bully launched another swift swing, but Hui Yan's eyes tracked the movement perfectly. His feet moved of their own accord across the stone floor. Diving cleanly under the giant fist, the young man landed another precise counterpunch right on the enemy's cheek. The hero stared in shock at his own hand, not understanding what had happened. He knew the Three Calamities style only in theory, but his body moved as if he were a 20-year veteran. And then the memory of the magical bamboo stick and the agility for 3 copper coins skill came flooding back. The bully roared in frustration, unleashing a barrage of heavy, wild blows. Huion realized that a single cheap purchase from the system had completely transformed his physical capabilities. Breaking through his opponent's defense, the young man landed a powerful straight punch right on the nose, sending blood spurting. The bald swindler collapsed backward, dazed and drooling. The most villainous smirk spread across Huion's face. The in-game purchase system turned out to be incredibly powerful. Realizing that in this world, money meant immediate power, the young man decided to leave the mountain as soon as possible and build a trading empire. However, the bully hadn't given up yet. Slowly getting to his feet and wiping away his drool, he vowed revenge. The air around Huion grew noticeably colder. His opponent's aura was becoming dangerous. Exhaling a cloud of white vapor, the bully channeled his inner energy. He moved 3 times faster than before, and his fists created shockwaves, forcing Huion to defend himself. Huion's boots slid across the stone. There was almost no room left to maneuver. The bully swung his fist in a blow capable of breaking the boy's bones. A maniacal smile of victory was frozen on his face. Huion knew that without his own inner energy, mere agility wouldn't save him from a direct hit. Suddenly, a smooth wooden sheath blocked the bully's fist with a ringing crack. Shenhua stepped down from the balcony, positioning himself between them with incredible elegance. Giving the bully a cold stare, he asked if the man wasn't ashamed to use internal energy against a novice. In a panic, the bully pointed at Huion, screaming that he was the one who had thrown sand at him first. Changhua glanced at Huion, acknowledging that the remark was fair. And glaring at him angrily, the master remarked that such street tricks brought shame upon the entire Udon sect. He ordered Huion to wait while a punishment was decided. Huion agreed with feigned sadness. The instructor stepped forward and officially announced the end of the trial. Changhua withdrew, satisfied with the outcome of the experiment. The protagonist rejoiced inwardly, mentally clenching his fist in triumph. He had managed to humiliate his sworn enemy, earn a reputation as a fraud, and secure his ticket out of the cult. Glancing at the moon, he was already planning what luxury goods he would deal in tomorrow after leaving. But in the main pavilion, Qianhua was deep in thought. Sheng Yun asked how he was feeling, and the master replied that he felt fine. The instructor demanded that Huion be expelled immediately for using sand and bringing shame upon the mountain. Changhua remained silent for a long time, his eyes closed. He asked his younger brother if he had noticed the boy's movements. The master pointed out that Huion had only mastered the basic style a couple of days ago, and yet his evasion and counterattacks were flawless, revealing a hidden martial arts genius within him. Cheng Yun objected, saying that rules were rules and punishment was necessary. Qianhua agreed, but Cheng Yun didn't understand what his brother had in mind and asked again. Then Changhua smiled and suggested a special punishment. The next morning, the instructor announced that as punishment, Mu Huiyang would serve in the Goksan Pavilion. He told him to be immensely grateful for Chenghua's mercy. The instructor left, muttering under his breath about why they hadn't just expelled the boy, leaving Huion alone. Huion's soul literally left his body. He hadn't been expelled. Grabbing his hair, he screamed inwardly, unable to understand why they'd kicked him out because of the pictures, but decided to keep him around because of the sand in his eyes. His brilliant plan had fallen apart because of that handsome craftsman who decided to do him a favor. Osu ran over, patted him on the back, expressing relief, and suggesting they now set their sights on the inner disciples. Huion stared at him as if he were speaking in riddles. The young man remembered that he didn't have a shred of talent for martial arts, just like in his first life. Opening the system interface, he glanced at the exorbitant prices for high-level talents, which were still out of his reach. With a heavy sigh, the young man decided to accept his fate for now. After saying goodbye to Osu, he headed for the Goksan Pavilion. Realizing that his plan to drop out early had fallen through, the hero began looking for a different approach. Approaching the pavilion's heavy gates, the young man realized that this was where all of Udon's wealth was concentrated. He then decided to simply take some of the money for himself. Opening the sliding doors, the young man froze at the sight of a familiar, handsome face right in front of him. He asked Changhua if he was indeed the head of the finance department. Changhua explained that he belonged to a different department, but that his senior colleague was in charge of the local operations, so he had arranged for Huiyan to work as a messenger. The protagonist listened with his mouth agape. The master added that now Huion would have to deliver documents to all the pavilions on the mountain, climbing the rocks for 4 hours at a time. The master encouraged him, suggesting that he follow him to learn the local terrain. However, the young man was in no hurry to follow his new boss. Huion's face turned pale at the realization of his inevitable doom. That same night, Huion frantically packed his belongings in his room. The mountain had over 10 branches, some of which were located right on the steep cliffs. He was determined not to risk his second life for the sake of a courier job. Treading quietly, the young man crept down the hallway. Under cover of night, he passed through the main courtyard and rushed toward the gate, deciding that an escape under cover of darkness was the only sensible option. The scene changed. The moon hung high in the sky, and the silence of the night reigned all around. The protagonist slipped out of the dormitory, having already regretted the decisions he'd made in life 1,000 times before he even reached the gate. Glancing around, the young man realized that the night trails of Mount Udan were shrouded in darkness. Glancing at his personal donation menu, the fugitive daydreamed about buying the night vision skill for 80 Leon, but the store had a strict cash-only policy. No coupons were accepted. Left without a penny to his name, the poor fellow was forced to resort to the most high-tech tool of stealth, a huge, blazing torch. Fully aware that he had turned into a walking target, the young man still didn't want to foolishly fall off the cliff and die. Getting nervous, the guy tried to convince himself that the mountain was too big for anyone to spot him. However, he hadn't even taken 3 steps. He stumbled right into a night patrol. Their faces didn't look very friendly. Blades immediately sprang from their sheaths, and He Yang instantly played his trump card. Brazen and shameless deception. He told the guards a tall tale, claiming he was an innocent herb gatherer who had simply lain down for a nap and woken up in complete darkness. One guard gave him a look as if he were the worst liar on the entire mountain, so He Yang hurried to present his evidence. As it turned out, the trickster had simply pulled the first armful of weeds he came across from the side of the trail. After looking at the leaves and then at each other, the patrolman concluded that they clearly weren't paid to know the local flora. The sweat pouring off the fugitive betrayed his hope that the guards wouldn't turn out to be botanists. Fortunately for him, the guards considered this none of their business. After returning the torch, the guards merely advised the young man to be more careful on his way down. Hurrying down the steps, the fugitive inwardly rejoiced, praising his incredible diplomatic skills. The main gate was literally right in front of him. He was absolutely certain that nothing would now stand in the way of his triumphant return to merchant life. And then a voice rang out from the shadows, calling the young man by name. It was a painfully familiar and terribly irritating voice that ruined all his plans. Shunhua stepped out of the darkness, with the smile of a man who had been waiting there for a good 2 hours. The master's imposing figure completely blocked the only path to freedom. At that moment, the protagonist felt like he wanted the ground to swallow him up. On his way back, the young man was consumed by a single question. How had the master figured out his planned escape? Shunhua explained with a chuckle that a true master's gaze sees right through any amateurish tricks. The mentor added that a person's face never lies, especially when their muscles twitch with an irresistible urge to flee. Bracing himself for the worst, He Yang asked what the master's future plans were for him. For the first time in a long while, Shunhua's gaze took on an unusually serious expression. The mentor sincerely wanted to understand why a young man with such colossal potential was so eager to leave a thriving sect that thousands of people dream of joining. Trying to brush it off with a joke, the fugitive cited the inhuman difficulty of the final trial for official disciples, which he would have failed anyway. The young man began to insist that he knew his limits all too well and lacked any talent whatsoever for surviving in a world of combat. Shunhua merely stared intently at him, not believing a word of this feigned self-criticism. The mentor called these excuses pathetic, reminding him that they both remembered his success on the entrance exam very well. In a gentler tone, the master urged him to answer honestly, since his outstanding abilities were obvious to everyone. In his mind, He Yang grimaced, realizing he couldn't explain the nature of his talent, which lay in a digital shopping cart, in so many words. So the young man decided to drastically change his tactics and resort to a completely different ruse. Striking a grand pose, he declared to the master that the Udon sect was simply too small to contain all his greatness. A deafening silence fell over the courtyard. A cold sweat instantly broke out on the fugitive's forehead at the thought that he might have crossed the line beyond which execution for disrespect awaited. Glancing at his mentor, the young man noticed that he was trembling and making strange sounds. However, Chunhua suddenly burst out laughing, admitting that he had finally realized what a weirdo he was dealing with. He Yang's eyes lit up with hope. Could it be that this arrogant speech had worked, and he would be set free to go wherever he pleased? But the master looked at him and gave a firm refusal. The mentor explained that, as a true master of Udon, he had no right to let such an ambitious young man go without first demonstrating the sect's true power to him. Slowly drawing his blade, whose steel glinted in the moonlight, Chunhua promised to show the young man the very essence of the Udon martial art. A sudden gust of wind nearly snatched the torch from He Yang's hands. The atmosphere changed abruptly, and the air became incredibly heavy. Chunhua nearly soared into the air as his blue robes fluttered in the wind. A huge circle of energy glowed on the stone floor around them. The master urged the young man to watch as closely as possible. No sooner had the mentor taken a step than the very ground beneath his feet seemed to ripple like waves. In the darkness of the night, his sword movements left flawless, glowing blue trails. He Yang froze in place, his eyes wide with amazement at the incredible sight. The movement seemed surprisingly gentle and fluid, like the current of a calm river. Yet in the very next instant, they took on a frenzied power comparable to the speed of a raging storm. It was a perfect interweaving of soft and hard energy, continuous and full of crushing power. Before him stood the highest pinnacle of Udon's martial philosophy, the sword of Tai Chi wisdom. It stood right before him in the form of the master. A massive yin-yang symbol made of the purest energy shone brightly across the entire courtyard. The protagonist stood completely transfixed, awed by the grandiose scale of this power. With a satisfied smirk, Chunhua sheathed his sword and asked if the young man had grasped the full depth of the sect's mastery. He Yang, his face completely blank, remarked that the light show looked impressive, but he still had no idea what to make of it all. With a click, the master sheathed his blade, expecting a profound philosophical question about the way of the sword. Chunhua added that since He Yang had doubted Udon's capabilities, they had decided to give him a vivid demonstration of the depth of their traditions. Stepping closer, the master held out his hand, which was shrouded in a soft purple glow. The master boasted that there was no genius or monster that the Udon sect could not accommodate. He Yang merely covered his face with his hand, letting out a heavy groan of exhaustion. To himself, the young man was genuinely puzzled as to why any conversation among swordsmen always boiled down to fights, and how a future tycoon was supposed to survive among these battle-obsessed monks. Clearing his throat, the young man politely apologized for his earlier arrogant remarks. But at the same time, he still declared loudly that there was no way he would stay on this mountain. Chunhua's face instantly darkened, and he demanded to know the real reason. The fugitive simply put his hands on his hips and shouted that he simply didn't want to, and that the master couldn't force him to do anything. Lost in thought, Chunhua rubbed his chin thoughtfully. With a sigh, the mentor remarked that the young man had absolutely no idea how blessed he was by fate. Allowing someone with such talent to ruin his life would be tantamount to standing by indifferently while a child jumps into a well. He Yang merely blinked in confusion, not understanding where the master was going with this. And what the master was getting at was that the young man was officially placed under house arrest, forbidden to leave the mountain without personal permission. Chunhua pointed out that since the young man's family had paid a huge admission fee, his parents would be thrilled about private lessons from the great master. He Yang finally lost his temper, hysterically demanding an explanation for this unhealthy fixation on him. The young man insisted once again that he was just an ordinary village boy from a simple family. He wanted to understand why, all of a sudden, the wealthiest sect was trying so desperately to keep an ordinary student. Staring at the master with a fierce glare, he desperately waited for a logical explanation. However, Chunhua merely pointed at him with a smile, and in the glow of the moonlight, declared that his reason was simple. Simply because. The next morning, after the failure of his grand plan, He Yang examined his new wooden token. From now on, he was a temporary disciple of the main sect. Chunhua explained that keeping an eye on him as an ordinary disciple was too difficult, so they decided to promote him. The master admitted that he had wanted to make him a permanent disciple right away, but the sect leader didn't trust the disciple and refused to sign the papers. Nevertheless, the mentor encouraged the young man, promising that with enough diligence, he would quickly become a full-fledged member. With his face buried in his hands, the protagonist let out the saddest groan in history. To purchase high-level escape skills, the young man urgently needed to come up with a substantial sum of money. The idea of revealing the secret of the shop's system was immediately rejected out of fear of being locked in the basement for experiments. The young man calculated that even a small amount of starting capital would be enough to purchase the skills necessary for his escape. Pausing, he called out to his mentor. Looking the master straight in the eye, the young man asked if he had any cash on hand. Chunhua's face instantly contorted with deep disgust. It was the first time anyone had asked him for such a thing. Scratching his cheek, the young man asked him to stop looking at him like a beggar and explained that he simply wanted to exchange his voucher for 75 liang of sound coin. The master pointed out that money was absolutely useless on Mount Udan, but He Yang merely shrugged, replying that he simply liked the way it looked. After which, Chunhua finally took the voucher for the exchange. Together, they entered the Guojian Pavilion, the mountain's main financial center, where the young man was to serve his sentence. Chunhua took out an impressively heavy bundle of copper coins. However, instead of handing it over, the master held the bundle aloft and declared that he would keep the coins until the end of his shift. He Yang's eyes nearly popped out of his head at such audacity, and he shouted that this was outright theft. In a state of complete panic, the young man bombarded his mentor with financial jargon, explaining that the present value of money was significantly higher than its future value. Chunhua merely blinked in confusion, asking if the young man was trying to charge him interest, to which the young man simply demanded his money back. Hiding the bundle deep inside his sleeve, the master leaned in closer and remarked with a sly grin that if he gave the coins back now, He Yang would immediately use them for his next escape, so he would only give them back to him after his shift was over. Suddenly, someone in heavy boots entered, and a weary voice rang out from the back of the room, asking what all the commotion was about. Rubbing his head, the master entered the room, grumbling that he'd been disturbed from his nap. It was Chen Su's older brother, who looked as if he hadn't slept since the days of the previous dynasty. Chunhua greeted him warmly, but Chen Su snapped back, asking him to save the grand titles for a place other than this refuge for exiled outcasts. Glancing at He Yang, he gave him an appraising look, making it clear that he saw not the slightest hint of fighting ability in the young man. After merely bowing, Chunhua replied that he was leaving the young man in his capable hands. The mentor withdrew, leaving He Yang alone with the haggard overseer. The young man stood waiting, wondering what terrible task they would assign him this time. He began to suspect that the two masters had conspired against him, but with no money and no way to escape, he had no choice but to obey. Changsu ordered him to follow him. The overseer outlined the daily schedule. The workday lasted from the hour of the rabbit to the hour of the rooster. That meant from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m., and their main duty was to deliver bamboo tubes to the Samjian Pavilion. He Yang's face fell as he looked at the pavilion, perched right at the very top of the highest cliff. The young man cried out that he didn't even know the basic light step technique, so such an assignment was tantamount to a death sentence. With horror in his eyes, the young man stared at the steep incline. At that moment, Chen Su opened the storeroom, revealing a sack of tubes 3 times the size of He Yang himself. The protagonist immediately threw a tantrum on the floor, kicking his legs and screaming that he would surely crash to his death. Chang Su coldly warned the young man that if he refused the assignment, he would be expelled for negligence. The young man was delighted, for his cherished dream of being expelled might come true. However, the overseer added one small detail. Since the young man was now registered as a disciple of the main sect, the traditional rules for expulsion applied to him. In the Wudan sect, disciples expelled for crimes or negligence were not allowed to simply walk away with the sect's secrets. Their Dan Tian, the internal energy center, turning the person into a bedridden cripple for the rest of their life. Then the master left, suggesting that he come to the pavilion head's office once he was finished. Lying on the floor and clutching his stomach with a trembling hand, the young man realized that the promotion had been arranged precisely to lure him into this trap. Slowly getting to his feet, the poor fellow realized that the cunning master had completely outmaneuvered him. Hoisting the enormous sack onto his back, the young man cursed quietly under his breath. Reaching the base of the cliff, he grabbed hold of the first rocky ledge. As he began the grueling climb up the sheer cliff, the young man shouted into the wind that he would make the entire Udan sect pay for this. The morning sun rose over the Udan mountains, heralding a perfect and peaceful start to the day. But at that very moment, a lone hand was clinging to the edge of the cliff with its last ounce of strength. After scrambling onto a flat rock, He Yang was breathing heavily, as if his lungs were about to give out. Collapsing onto his back, the young man was absolutely certain that the game over message would flash before his eyes at any moment. Gazing at the dawn, he tried to console himself with at least the beautiful view. But just then, Qiansu approached from behind, and without a word, dumped a huge new stack of assignments onto his chest. The supervisor noticed in a flash that the young man was falling behind schedule and wouldn't let him rest until all the mail had been delivered. Hu Yang remained lying there, forcing the most fake and lifeless smile. Inside, however, his merchant's soul was hurling the most exquisite curses at the entire Wudon sect. The next morning, Qiansu stepped outside the pavilion's gates and found Chunhua there, looking incredibly cheerful. The guest asked his older brother how the young man had fared on his first day of work. Qiansu gave him a stern look, asking if he was seriously playing the fool after having personally recommended the most dangerous cliff on the mountain. Xunhua just laughed it off, to which Changsu replied that his sense of humor was deeply twisted. After all, the Samjian Pavilion Cliff wasn't just a postal route, but a true training ground for Udon's legendary light step technique, the steps of the blue clouds. An ordinary student who tried to climb it without understanding energy circulation would instantly lose their balance. Their foot would slip off the rock, sending the daredevil plummeting off the cliff, which perfectly explained the place's reputation as a nightmare for beginners. Xunhua noted that although he had suggested the route, it was Qiansu who had forced the young man to climb there in complete darkness. To this, Changsu objected that climbing that wall at night without moonlight would have been physically impossible. However, he then fell silent and added with deep seriousness that ordinary logic did not apply to this young man. The warden offered to retrieve the remaining mail himself, but Xunhua asked how much could possibly be left there. Peering into the room, the master was stunned. The storeroom turned out to be completely empty. Xiangsu closed his eyes with an incredibly smug look. He noted that there was absolutely nothing to be surprised about. Both masters glanced at He Yang, who was curled up in a ball on the carpet, fast asleep under a heavy blanket. Xiangsu explained that the young man had cleared out every single piece of paper in a single night, which meant he had climbed the sheer cliff at least 3 times in a row in complete darkness. According to him, he had never before seen anyone master the basics of the blue cloud steps on their very first try. He recalled how the young man had to hold the tubes between his teeth when both hands were occupied with scrambling over the rocks. Impressed by his natural talent, the master called the young man a true genius among geniuses. With a sigh, he lamented that if the boy had entered Wudon 10 years earlier, he would have become the pillar of the entire martial arts world. But suddenly, Chunhua called out to his brother, and he was surprised. Looking at the sleeping, drooling teenager, Chunhua smiled ominously and suggested they push him even harder. After a while, the protagonist slowly opened his eyes, looking like a zombie that had crawled out of a swamp. Yawning sweetly, he shuddered at the memory of the horror he had endured on the cliff. Noticing the fur blanket on his shoulders, the boy realized he had survived only thanks to a cheap agility skill from his system. At that moment, Qiansu loomed over him, asking mockingly if he was already tired from such menial work. The master ordered him to immediately get his lazy ass off the floor. He Yang politely tried to return the blanket with gratitude, but the overseer asked with disgust if he was planning to hand over a blanket stained with drool. Ordering him to throw it away or sell it, the master nudged the young man toward the decision to happily keep the precious item for himself. As he gathered his things, the boy felt his mentor's silent gaze upon him. Shang-Su ordered him to take a new batch of letters and follow him. He added that they needed to go to a very specific place. After a while, their shoes clattered along the stone path. He Yang followed silently, wondering what kind of trick they had in store for him this time. Noticing that the path led to the same cliff, the young man began to wonder if he was destined to work as a mail carrier forever. Suddenly, Chang-Su tossed a piece of cloth backward, hitting He Yang right in the face. Staring at the blue cloth, the young man wondered why he'd been given a blindfold. Qiansu curtly ordered the young man to blindfold himself and climb the sheer wall again, with the blindfold on. In a fit of rage, He Yang flung the cloth to the ground. He shouted at the master, asking what made him think that climbing at night would give him the ability to navigate without sight. Pointing out the huge difference between the darkness of night and complete blindness, the young man flatly refused to carry out such a crazy order. Chang-Su asked calmly whether the young man would prefer to have his energy center destroyed, after which He Yang tied the blindfold over his eyes without hesitation. Standing before a gigantic rock in complete darkness, the young man wondered how his life had come to this. Touching the cold stone, the young man was convinced that the masters of Udon were simply looking for a legitimate way to kill him. He slowly began his ascent, feeling for the slightest ledges with his feet. A skill from the system gave him a slight boost to his reaction time, but any mistake threatened to flatten him like a pancake. Reaching his hand upward, he noticed a sudden blue glow on his fingers. Freezing in place, the young man gripped the stone more tightly. Tilting his head beneath the bandage, the young man felt a strange sensation in his eyes. Right through the thick fabric, his vision cleared, and he began to see. And a huge glowing blue map of energy nodes appeared on the surface of the rock, indicating the exact route. It was an absolutely incredible sensation. His eyes remained closed, but the path shone brighter than before. Blue lines connected the glowing points all the way up the cliff. The guy realized that his donation system had given him a real cheat sheet. As he pulled himself upward, he moved with absolute precision. Each subsequent grip was made without the slightest hesitation. His glowing foot landed precisely on a blue energy node. Despite the sweat beading on his skin, his movements became completely fluid. It was as if the rock itself were guiding him, compelling his body to move in a perfectly natural rhythm. Every step aligned flawlessly with the flow of energy. The one perfect path led him to the summit, revealing the true essence of the udon technique. Upon reaching the very top, the young man pulled off his blindfold and eagerly gulped in the fresh air. Gazing up at the sky, he felt a pleasant warmth spread throughout his body. Touching his stomach, the young man felt his energy center burning. This supreme art was radically different from the cheap skills he had tried to master in his past life. Suddenly, Qiansu smacked him across the head with a thick tome, asking who had given him permission to remove the bandage. Rubbing the bruised spot, the young man complained about the physical punishment. Glancing at the book's cover, he read the title, Steps of the Blue Clouds. The mentor informed him that he had officially mastered the first stage of the technique. The master explained that He Yang had only mastered it physically, so he was now required to study the theory from the manual. As he examined the book, the young man felt a surge of genuine delight. He recalled his failures with the basic arts. In his past life, those failures had stemmed from a lack of talent. Now, however, he held the elite manual of a great sect in his hands, and his body radiated a blue aura. The young man cackled menacingly to himself, like a cartoon villain, causing Qiansu to wipe away a drop of sweat in surprise. The mentor added that this technique was merely an insignificant fraction of Udon's true power. According to him, once he became an official disciple, the young man would gain access to deeper secrets. Leaning forward, the master asked mockingly if he still wanted to run away. He Yang immediately tried to negotiate, asking whether disciples of the main sect were permitted to engage in trade within secular society. Qiansu replied that the finance department did indeed handle external affairs. The young man's eyes lit up, and he asked hopefully if he could manage a massive trading guild on behalf of Udon. Looking at him with an impassive gaze, the master explained that, with the head's permission, he would at least be able to work as a security guard in the outside world. Slightly disappointed, He Yang handed the bag of mail to the grateful monk. After saying goodbye, the young man announced that his shift was over and that he intended to go to sleep. But Qiansu stopped him, asking where he was going if his work wasn't finished yet. It turned out that the schedule had been changed yesterday, and from now on, the young man was responsible for all the department's mail. He Yang's face contorted with fierce rage. In his mind, he raged at the unprecedented audacity of these foremen. Gritting his teeth, the young man seethed that they had ruined such a wonderful moment of triumph for him. He shouted at his mentor, demanding to know how they could change the agreement without the other party's consent. The young man bellowed that even bandits had more respect for an agreement than this sect of mad monks with pigtails. The master's eyes turned icy, and in that very instant, his fist plunged straight into He Yan's stomach. The young man's soul nearly left his body as he let out a pained gasp. As he collapsed to the ground, the young man heard from Qiansu that he clearly had a fixation on suicide. Looking down at him, the mentor warned him of the consequences of disrespecting his elders. He asked if the boy had confused the sect with the outside world, where secular students could speak their minds with impunity. The order to return to work echoed across the mountain, accompanied by the threat of even harsher punitive measures. A short time later, a torrential downpour crashed down on the Udon mountain complex. He Yang ran beneath the wall of rain, shielding his head with his hands. Soaked to the bone, he dashed out into the courtyard. Wringing out his waterlogged black shirt, the young man sighed at his difficult lot in life. After taking it off to let it dry, the young man stood with his torso bare, revealing abs that looked as if they'd been carved by an ancient sculptor. He muttered something under his breath about the sudden bad weather. 2 months had already passed since he'd mastered the steps of the blue clouds. Over time, his body had grown accustomed to the grueling workouts, and he still had plenty of energy, even after delivering all the mail. He had some free time left. Along with his physical development, the menu of his donation shop had also been updated. The selection had expanded so much that the high-level skills wouldn't even fit on the screen. The guy grinned, comparing what was happening to leveling up a character in a good old-fashioned RPG. And just then, a heavy fist came crashing down right on the top of his head, nearly smashing his face into the floor. Rubbing his sore bump, the young man yelled at Qiansu, asking why he was always sneaking up from behind. The master pointed to two barely visible glowing blue marks, warning him that he was still putting too much pressure on his feet. He Yang protested, though he admitted to himself that the master's beatings were actually the highest art of acupressure for clearing the meridians. Glancing at him, Qiansu acknowledged that the young man had finally reached a reasonable minimum. Suddenly, the door swung open, and Chunhua announced that it was time to begin the real training in the Dao Pavilion. Yang asked if the postal shifts were over, but Chunhua laughed and replied that he would have to work whenever he wasn't training. With a warm smile, the master promised to introduce him to his other students. He added that in the future, these people would become his senior brothers in arms. The protagonist nodded, gazing at the giant training hall visible in the distance. Walking behind Chunhua, the young man became deeply lost in thought. He believed that now, at last, they would begin teaching him real martial arts, instead of just delivering mail. He recalled his annoyance when Chunhua first dragged him here, like a puppy on a leash. And even though practicing his footwork had turned out to be useful, the cunning master had never taught him a single fighting technique. Whenever he asked questions, Chunhua would just smile and say that everything had its time. At the time, it had seemed like a trite excuse, but now the young man hoped that the senior students would at least be as friendly as his acquaintance, Jian Oshu. The moment he stepped into the courtyard, the boy's face instantly contorted with wild terror. Chunhua, meanwhile, stood nearby with an incredibly proud expression. Lowering his eyes, He Yang froze. A crowd of 8-year-old kids ran up to him, who were poking him in the face with broken grass whistles and demanding that he fix them immediately. The boy froze, looking utterly defeated, realizing that his older peers were the very same little rascals from whom he used to wheedle out coins. He just couldn't wrap his head around it. After all, he was already 20 years old. Changhua just chuckled, explaining that in the world of martial arts, age meant absolutely nothing compared to seniority. The young man desperately tried to find any loophole to escape this nightmare, arguing that he was still only a temporary student. Changhua told him to stop complaining and remarked that from now on, they would be seeing each other very often. After that, the incredible Trollmaster simply soared 50 feet into the air and flew away, leaving Huiyun alone with the kids. And so he stood frozen, with his hand raised, realizing that he had been mercilessly abandoned. A little boy crept up behind him and asked if he was their new little brother. Standing before him was Myung-sung, a child with an angelic face and the mannerisms of a stern, mid-level corporate manager. Tilting his head to one side, he demanded an answer with absolute authority. The young man merely muttered a half-hearted reply, realizing that this kid was indeed the oldest among all the children. The boy immediately began lecturing him for his disrespectful tone, which already left Huiyun feeling utterly exhausted. Watching him, Huiyun wondered what kind of harsh boarding school environment could have produced such a uptight and proper child. Myung-sun accused him of trying to disturb the sacred peace of Mount Udan, claiming that the other children were losing their concentration because Huiyun was running around and selling grass whistles. Huiyun gave him a once-over, and his merchant's radar instantly discerned the boy's true motives. He asked the boy if he really considered the legendary grass flutes to be mere toys. It dawned on him that the kid wasn't actually angry about the rules. He was simply jealous because he hadn't gotten a whistle. So the hero decided to employ a classic sales strategy to win over his superiors. The scene shifted. A surprisingly beautiful melody echoed through the quiet courtyard. The music soared toward the sky, sounding incredibly soothing. Holding a fresh green leaf to his lips, the young man began to play. The children stopped their practice and listened spellbound to his performance, their eyes shining. Myung-sun's stern expression melted away the moment he glanced at the musician. Turning the leaf between his fingers, Huiyun realized that it was important for an elder to set a good example, and offered him the flute as a free gift, as a sign of respect. Hesitantly reaching out, the boy grabbed the sheet of paper with his tiny palm. He tried to put on a calm front, cleared his throat, and declared that he was accepting the gift solely out of politeness, while his friends whispered behind his back about how easily he'd given in. However, their sweet exchange of toys was suddenly interrupted by a very low and aggressive voice. A group of older students stepped into the courtyard, casting their shadows over the younger children. Myung-sun's eyes narrowed as he asked what they were doing on their training grounds. Standing before them was Myung-han, a kid who was technically 12, but looked like a grown man. Huion was completely confused by the naming traditions at Udan, but he snapped out of it with the realization that keeping track of all these similar names was simply impossible. The burly man grinned and asked Myung-sun if he wasn't ashamed to be playing around with pieces of paper in front of the younger ones. Huion stared at his massive jaw, seriously doubting whether this guy was even a kid. The bully stepped toward Huion, towering over him like a solid wall of muscle. He declared that selling cheap toys on the mountain was a crime punishable by having one's arms broken. Myung immediately stepped in front of Huion, trying to protect his business partner. The bully barked at him, furious that they were treating a newcomer from the outside world like a brother. Grinning, he realized that Huion was the very same newcomer from the rumors who had been dumped into their unit. His friends behind him burst into laughter, teasing Huion for trying to learn martial arts at the ripe old age of 17. The bully took a step forward, his heavy boots clacking loudly against the stone. Pointing a finger at Huion, he asked if the guy was stupid, then raised his finger, aiming it straight at the boy's nose. Myung-sun suddenly stepped between them, blocking the bully's arm with his wooden sword with a sharp clang. He told the bully to back off Huion. After all, he was his younger brother. The giant bully glared down at him fiercely, veins bulging, and asked if he was really looking for a fight. Huion stood behind them, looking completely unperturbed, not enjoying the spectacle. Watching the scuffle, the boy wondered how he'd even ended up in the middle of an elementary school turf war. Myung whispered to him that these bullies were actually Master Chang-su's students. He explained that because of the rivalry between Chang-su and Changhua, their students were constantly trying to beat each other up. The burly guy ordered Myung-sun to get out of the way so he could teach the newcomer a lesson in manners. Myung-sun flatly refused, stating that since Huion belonged to his branch, any punishment had to go through him. Leaping into the air behind them, another boy declared himself the true leader. Myung-sun drew his wooden sword and, with a cold stare, proposed settling the matter with their swords. The burly boy grinned, gripping his wooden weapon more tightly. He lunged forward, and their wooden swords clashed with a crash that sent splinters flying. Myung began cheering from behind, shouting out historical statistics on Myung-sun's wins and losses against this bully. According to him, statistically speaking, their side was guaranteed victory in this duel. Huion watched the fight, but as he tracked their movements, it dawned on him that something had changed drastically. Unlike in his past life, where fights had seemed like nothing more than a blur of violence, he could now see every detail clearly. He could clearly see the blue energy nodes flaring up beneath their feet as they moved across the courtyard. Both of them were using the basic blue cloud footwork, which meant he could predict their next 3 moves. Ducking under a wide swing, Myung-sun landed a powerful sweeping kick. The force of the blow sent the giant bully flying backward across the stone floor. Crashing to the floor with a thud, the bully dropped his wooden sword with a clang. Myung-sun stood over him, breathing heavily, and ordered him to gather his friends and get lost. He glared menacingly down at his defeated opponent, keeping his voice firm despite his exhaustion. Another bully who had run up protested that his words sounded far too harsh. Another boy stepped forward with a smug grin, his whole demeanor making it clear that the fight was far from over. Glancing at Myung-sun, he asked if he'd like to go for a second round against a fresh opponent. Swinging his sword, Myung-sun caught his breath and prepared for the next fight. He was clearly on the verge of fainting from exhaustion, but his pride would not allow him to back down. Raising his blade, he replied that his opponent could attack at any moment. Huion sat behind them, genuinely amazed by the sheer stubbornness of these young men. The fight began, and the echo of wooden clashes rang out across the courtyard as they exchanged heavy blows. However, Myung-sun's strength was running out, and his movements were growing slower and slower. The sword knocked from his hands soared high into the air, and a moment later, plunged into the ground. His opponent pressed the wooden blade directly against Myung-sun's throat, trying to catch his breath and already rejoicing in his victory. Myung immediately stepped forward next, drawing his wooden sword to continue the series of duels. He asked the bully if he was planning to run away after defeating his exhausted opponent. The bully smirked, telling him to stop talking and show what he was capable of. They instantly locked in combat, their wooden swords clashing with a ringing clang. Huion analyzed the format of the duel, realizing that it was a classic team elimination relay. After assessing the situation, he realized that even though Myung was decent, their team was outnumbered. The other children on their side were too small, and they simply lacked the physical strength to put up a fight. At that age, even a 1-year difference in height gave an absolute, insurmountable advantage. One by one, the younger students from the Changhua line were sent flying in all directions, crashing onto the stone floor. Huiyan watched them fall, realizing that their group was headed for a total, crushing defeat. The giant bully slowly stood up and glared at Huiyan with a nasty smirk. Huiyang looked at him with a completely emotionless expression, though his mind was already racing. The hulking brute, for his part, realized that now that all the defenders had been defeated, he could finally teach the newcomer from the mortal world a lesson himself. Glancing at the children, who were crying and clutching their bruised arms, the protagonist realized that they had truly put themselves at risk to protect him. Admitting to a slight sense of guilt for holding back, he slowly stood up and asked the burly man if he'd like to try teaching him a lesson. The bully stared at him as if he'd spoken in a foreign language. With a snort, he told Huiyan that if he got down on his knees right then and there and asked for forgiveness, he'd let the whole thing slide as a joke. Looking him straight in the eye, Huiyan replied that his offer was absolute garbage. The bully's smirk vanished, and his fists clenched until his knuckles turned white. Huiyan mocked his opponent's pompous speech and asked if he was drunk, teasing him about his mature appearance that allowed him to buy alcohol. Losing his temper, the bully unleashed a powerful, lightning-fast punch straight at Huiyan's face. He roared with rage when Huiyan effortlessly dodged the massive fist. The young man moved like water, his boots gliding across the stone slabs. A confident smirk played across his face, for he had entered this fight with a clear plan in mind. Having watched every one of their duels, and thanks to his heightened perception, he had already memorized all of the bully's movement patterns and was dodging them. 30 years of experience as a merchant, watching masters fight, had given him a huge mental advantage. And since the bully's footwork was entirely based on the blue cloud steps, the young man could see every attack a mile away and dodged the swings with millimeter precision. The bully was breathing heavily, completely unable to even graze him. Completely bewildered, he looked around, wondering how a mere street urchin could move like a ghost. Huiyan prepared to land a counterpunch to the ribs, but as he closed the distance, his fist simply bounced off the burly man's dense muscles, and a wave of pain shot through his arm. Glancing at his bruised wrist, he realized he'd made a colossal miscalculation. Although his footwork and perception were at a master's level, his own body was still incredibly weak. He simply lacked the physical strength to harm an inner disciple who had been cultivating internal energy for years. Compared to these kids, who tortured themselves with training every day, he was just an ordinary person. He could dodge endlessly, but if the Hulk landed even a single clean blow, his frail body would be shattered into pieces. Watching the giant wind up for another powerful blow, he realized he needed to change his tactics immediately. Staring fiercely at his opponent, he prepared to take a huge risk. Lunging forward, he feigned a willingness to engage in a direct exchange of blows. The burly man threw a heavy punch right at his face. The punch only grazed Huiyan's cheek, leaving a thin, bloody scratch. The bully flinched, realizing that the guy hadn't even tried to block the punch. Using the momentum from the fist that had whizzed past him, Huiyan spun through the air and dramatically flew backward, pretending to take a fatal blow. The children standing nearby watched in utter shock, their faces completely pale. Myung-sun and Myung-gyong gasped, convinced that their new little brother had just been destroyed. Huiyan crashed onto the stone floor with a thud, kicking up a cloud of dust. He lay face down, steam rising from his body, looking utterly defeated. When the dust settled, the giant bully frantically examined his hand, unsure whether he'd actually hit the boy. After all, the boy had pulled off the most legendary prank in Murim. Suddenly, a thunderous voice boomed across the courtyard. The adults had arrived. They were Changhua, the local genius troll of Udana, and Chang Yu, an incredibly stern and haggard master of a rival branch. Zhang Yu was clearly having a bad day. He demanded an explanation of what was going on, his face betraying utter shock. Myung Han instantly broke out in a cold sweat and began to stutter, like a child caught doing something wrong. Zhang Yu placed his hand on the boy's head, but there was no tenderness in the gesture. It was the classic look of a parent silently calculating how much this incident would cost his reputation. Trying to keep his composure, the master claimed he'd heard a commotion and had rushed over to see what had happened. Meanwhile, Changhua was playing his part in this drama to perfection. He was cradling Huiyan, almost as if on stage. As if on cue, Huion let a little fountain of blood spurt from his nose, adding even more comedy to the situation. Zhang Yu tried to brush it off, clearing his throat awkwardly and calling it a typical childhood squabble. However, Changhua had no intention of letting him get away with it so easily. Patting Huion on the back, Changhua asked indignantly whether a fighter's attack on an innocent child could really be considered a minor quarrel. In the background, Huion was surprised that the bleeding had stopped from the blows. And then the atmosphere changed abruptly. Changhua's playful expression gave way to a grim and menacing glare. He demanded an immediate apology to Huion. The tension in the air was palpable. Huion casually scratched his nose, completely unfazed by the deadly aura. He was engrossed in analyzing the high-stakes political drama unfolding between the two masters. He knew he had mastered the steps of the blue cloud. Changhua had no idea, and the young man was happy to let his senior use the situation to crush their enemies. Changhua clenched his teeth with an audible grind. He patted Myung-han on the shoulder and ordered him to apologize. Myung-han had no choice. Bowing his head, he extremely reluctantly forced out a humiliating apology to the guy he'd been trying to beat up just 5 minutes earlier. Chang Yu immediately turned away, eager to put this humiliating nightmare behind him as quickly as possible. But Huion was an experienced dealer. He hadn't thrown himself face first onto the hard concrete just for a cheap apology. The guy called out to them. The entire enemy group froze in place, turning to face this troublemaker, who was casually waving his hand. Pointing to his own nose, he asked if they were really going to leave without even asking the victim's opinion. Zhang Yu looked ready to explode with rage, but Huiyong merely smiled brightly and innocently beside the equally smug Changhua, asking for a little money to cover medical expenses. A supremely smug expression was frozen on his face. He was literally making the universal gesture for cash. He knew no shame. Zhang Yu watched in stunned silence as Huion calmly asked for 2 lien, while Zhang Hua laughed silently. He even feigned concern, asking if they didn't think such a sum was too high for the child's recovery. The local economic situation was quite simple. 1 silver liang was equal to an impressive 1,000 copper coins. For an ordinary student, that was a small fortune. However, Huiyong played his trump card and sighed, asking what the sect would think of a master who withheld money for the child's treatment. He gave them an ultimatum: either pay up or face disgrace. Zhang Yu realized he had been checkmated. He reached into his robes, his hand trembling with sheer rage. The master tossed 2 gleaming silver lian directly into Huiyon's outstretched palms. The payment went through successfully. His capital was growing. Zhang Yu demanded to know the young man's name, clearly intending to add him to his blacklist. Huion proudly introduced himself as Mu Huion. The master turned on his heel, his footsteps echoing loudly on the stone steps. He left with his battered apprentices, silently vowing to remember this little troublemaker. As soon as they were out of sight, Huion happily stashed away his hard-earned silver, while Changhua stood nearby, clearing his throat. The master casually suggested that, as a caring elder, he should take the heavy silver into his own safekeeping. Huion instantly clutched his purse. He pointed indignantly, warning Chang Yu not to be silly, since this money had been earned through his own sweat, blood, and a spectacular fall onto the concrete. Chang Yu smirked, praising him for his truly superb acting skills. He noted that the spectacle of a theatrical somersault in the air and a fall to the ground was a comedy act. Huion froze, realizing that his cover had been blown. Zhang Yu explained that he had been watching the entire fight from the very beginning. He had seen every dodge, every move, and had only intervened when Huiyong decided to pull off a stunt with a safety net. Zhang Yu asked Huiyong if he wasn't ashamed. After all, he hadn't even managed to land a single clean blow on his peer. Huiyong, looking indifferent, picked his ear with his finger. He replied that he wasn't ashamed in the least. The young man explained that since he had never formally studied martial arts, it was only natural that he couldn't compete with those who had devoted half their lives to training. Changhua clenched his fist. He noted that even though he wasn't his official teacher, he was still his senior, which meant it was his sacred duty to teach this shameless fellow the ways of udon. Huiyong merely stared at him with a completely blank expression. He declared that if such respect was required only of fighters, he didn't care. But before he could finish, Changhua's fist slammed into him. The ground literally exploded right where Huion had been standing just a moment ago. Changhua stood nearby, smiling calmly and brushing off his hands. He explained that Murim had its own rules, and mere claims of having nothing to do with martial arts didn't grant any leniency. Hugging his young students, the master told them with a cheerful smile that he was now personally teaching Huion a lesson in manners, so everyone could relax. Huion was lying face down in the same spot again, but this time with a huge, steaming bump on his head. Zhang Hua's intimidating fist loomed before his eyes. The boy begged for a break, but the training session was officially over, and the grueling routine had begun. Thus, a new, incredibly painful regimen was added to Huion's daily life on Mount Udan. These were daily training sessions with Changhua. The routine seemed deceptively simple. Huion was supposed to train under Changhua's watchful eye, and once the physical exercises were over, the master would brutally beat him with a flurry of punches. Changhua claimed that this was acupressure to cleanse the meridians, but his blows hurt more than Jiansu's. And while the effects of his training usually wore off within an hour, after such beatings, Huion's body would burn with hellish pain for more than half a day. Huion lay on the ground, literally steaming with exhaustion, and realizing he had reached his limit. He urgently needed to use the talent store. Pushing himself, he got to his feet, cursing quietly under his breath. He wanted to save up to buy a high-level talent, but his body risked not being able to withstand another blow from Changhua. He summoned the bamboo scroll, the system's glowing interface. Thanks to grueling training and hard work, several new talents had finally unlocked. And most importantly, he had 2 silver lian, extorted from an enemy master. It was time to spend them. He scrolled through the menu. Heavenly Bone and Heavenly Eye were out of reach due to their exorbitant prices, and the basic sword and physical talents cost 10 lian each. But then his gaze landed on a cheaper option. He tapped Level 8 Robust Constitution, which cost exactly 2 silver lian. Clutching the coins, he let the silver dissolve into the system's glowing dust. A surge of blue energy reshaped his muscles, and he grinned, ready to defend himself. The scene changed. Changhua stood in the courtyard with a serene expression. He asked Huion if he finally felt how the wonderful fruits of hard work were paying off. At that moment, Huion was lifting massive metal dumbbells, having taken off his shirts to reveal his well-defined 8-pack abs. The young man had transformed from a scrawny kid into a Greek god in record time, but he replied with an exhausted look. He felt no sense of reward, for every day had become an ordeal. Changhua sighed, feigning disappointment that his younger brother couldn't find joy in his own growing strength. He clenched his fists with a loud crack, suggesting they begin their usual daily routine. Assuming a low stance, he warned Huion not to tense his body, or else the precision strikes would cause twice as much pain. Zhang Hua lunged forward, delivering a powerful, energy-filled blow straight to Huion's chest. The blow was so strong that the heavy dumbbells flew out of Huion's hands, and the stone floor shook. However, Huion's expression changed. Instead of coughing up blood and collapsing, a wild grin spread across his face. The system's internal screen flashed, displaying his activated Robust Physique skill. Luminous blue spiritual armor formed over his chest. He had actually managed to withstand that blow. It dawned on him that the 2 silver lian were worth every copper coin spent. Zhang Hua stood there, somewhat bewildered. The protagonist realized that he didn't even need to save up for expensive high-level talents. He could simply collect dozens of cheap, low-level skills and build an overpowered setup. The young man rejoiced inwardly, believing he could become the strongest master in the world using only penny-cheap level 8 and 9 talents. Zhang Hua approached him and, narrowing his eyes, asked why Huion's body had suddenly become so incredibly resilient overnight. Zhang Hua smiled eerily and grimly as he rolled up his sleeves. He realized that since Huion's body was now capable of withstanding it, he could finally start hitting a little harder. Huion's smug grin vanished instantly as a gigantic, blue glowing fist of doom hurtled toward his face at tremendous speed. The entire training ground exploded in a gigantic pillar of dust and energy. There's always a good reason why cheap things are cheap. The dust cleared and the charming younger Myung-gyung peeked out from behind a stone wall, his eyes wide with concern. He called out to the protagonist, asking if his younger brother was still alive. Huion was sprawled flat on the floor, still reeling from the blow. Squatting down and rubbing his body, Huion complained of pain. Myung-gyung advised him to cry, since Changhua would give in, but Huion noted that such mercy was lacking. The boy suggested going to talk to Changhua, but Huion waved his arms frantically, strictly forbidding him to do so, because otherwise the daily beatings would become 10 times worse. Myung-gyung waved goodbye as Huion walked away and wished him a safe journey back to the finance hall. Huion walked with a heavy, exhausted sigh, his whole body aching from the workout. Glancing back at the child waving, he thought that although he appreciated the concern, the constant kindness only made his life on this mountain more complicated. Glancing at the majestic buildings of Udon, he firmly resolved to find a way to escape this sect at the very first opportunity. Upon entering the Gokcheon Pavilion, he found Master Zhang Zi sorting through papers. The master didn't even look up and lazily told Huiyan to get lost since there was no work for him. Huiyan begged for work and assignments for the finance hall. Changzi stared at him suspiciously, asking why he was so eager, and sent him to the Gundo Hall. All hope faded from Huiyan's eyes. Going to training meant running straight into the deadly fists of Changhua. He literally collapsed to the floor, clinging to Zhangzi's legs and begging for a task, screaming that he would die if he continued training with Zhanghua. Zhangzi angrily pushed him away, calling him pathetic and ordering him to get out. Suddenly, the heavy wooden doors creaked open. An apology was heard. Zhangzi stopped writhing and glanced over his shoulder. A disciple entered the room just as Zhangzi was dragging Huiyan by the ankle. The visitor reported on the market in Yichang and Shangxi's request for an escort for Udon. Zhangzi asked about the scale of the event, and the apprentice replied that 50 major guilds were participating. Huiyan's ears perked up instantly. It was a monumental event. Shangxi merchants were renowned for their fabulous wealth and controlled the western trade routes. For the sake of money, they hired top-tier sects like Udon, despite the sky-high prices. Zhangzi decided that 10 men would be enough for the escort and asked about the pay. The apprentice replied that they were offering 10 silver liang per person. Zhangzi considered 10 liang an excellent deal, but Huiyang's merchant's mind was in an uproar. Inside, he was screaming, cursing the Shangzi merchants as the ultimate misers. Clinging to Zhangzi's leg in righteous merchant fury, the young man shouted that hiring Udon's elite for 10 lian was robbery and called them thieving misers. The apprentice ignored the outcry and suggested buying a year's supply of salt from the Shanji merchants, who offered a discount on purchases of 500 sacks or more. Zhangzi smiled, thinking it was a good deal, but Huiyan's eyes nearly popped out of his head, and he yelled, asking if they had lost their minds. Zhangzi grabbed Huiyan by the collar and lifted him off the ground, asking if he was asking for trouble. The kid apologized, but insisted that the price was absurd. Zhangzi glared at him fiercely. How could the kid possibly know the prices if he hadn't even been part of the project when they were set? Huiyan froze, remembering his secret of being reborn from the future. However, he tapped the table, arguing that, given market conditions, the price for salt should be 60 sacks for 10 liang. Exactly double what had been offered. Zhangzi and the apprentice stared at him as if he were an alien. Huiyang crossed his arms, realizing that if he had missed something, it had to do with the timeline. And at that moment, the puzzle fell into place, and the young man's eyes lit up. He realized that the system governing the salt trade had not yet undergone a major reform. A government license was required for the legal trade in salt, and obtaining one was incredibly difficult. They were issued only along the dangerous northern border. Supplying the border was a nightmare, so the authorities lured wealthy merchants with lucrative salt patents. Thanks to this policy, the border became a major hub from which merchants distributed salt throughout the country, selling it at inflated prices. This ancient distribution system was known as the Heijon system. However, according to Huiyan's recollections of the future, the system was eventually abolished entirely and replaced by a new, historic reform. The famous Cholsokje system. Under this system, the state eliminated middlemen. Salt was delivered directly to local authorities, bypassing the border, which made logistics more cost-effective. Control of the salt trade passed to the government. In his past life, the young man never learned the true reasons behind the sudden abolition of the Geijon system. However, he suspected that the greedy merchants' evasion of massive taxes was merely a pretext for the authorities to strip them of their colossal economic influence. Whatever the intrigues might have been, the bottom line was simple. The Cholsukje system simplified the extraction and purchase of salt, causing its market value to plummet dramatically. Because of this, the price fell to less than half of what Udan had spent. The protagonist stood frozen in the middle of the room, deep in thought. It dawned on him. The Cholsukje system is being implemented this year. Listening to the discussions about the annual procurement, Huiyan realized a crucial detail. Udan's purchase of 500 sacks of salt at the current inflated price would result in a devastating financial catastrophe, since the market was headed for an inevitable crash as early as next month. The young man realized that merchants from Shaanxi had learned of the inside information and were dumping their goods before the price dropped. The deal would lead Udon to financial ruin. Taking a step forward, Huiyang confidently placed his hand on Zhang Zi's sleeve. The young man declared authoritatively that they couldn't buy salt right now. He had no intention of standing by and watching the lowland merchants fleece his mountain home. An irritated Zhang Zi asked how the kid could possibly know anything about trade, and reminded him that discounts from Shaanxi buyers were an unprecedented rarity. Huiyan asked point blank, "If stingy merchants are driving down prices for no reason, isn't there an obvious, hidden, and highly suspicious motive at play here?" Zhang Zi sighed and dismissed this as paranoia, but the protagonist began sharing some worldly wisdom that absolutely all merchants are cunning by nature and pursue only short-term profit. Raising his index finger, he remarked that price drops by shrewd businessmen always conceal self-interest. Folding his arms and looking grim, Zhang Zi asked Huiyan if he was willing to take full responsibility for what he had said. With a confident smirk, the young man confirmed his willingness to stand by his words. In his mind, he was already celebrating, imagining how, after saving Udon from bankruptcy thanks to the Cholsokje reform, everyone around him would look at him in a completely different light. The thought even flashed through his mind that perhaps they would now call him the brilliant Huiyan. However, Changzi's stern command made him forget all about that. He suggested they go to the sect leader immediately and repeat his words. Huiyon's face instantly went stiff, and his eyes widened as he stammered, asking whom exactly he was to address. The scene shifted to the majestic main hall of Udon, but the protagonist's expression remained unchanged. Huiyan stood before a carved wooden table of gigantic proportions, looking utterly tiny. Seated at the head of the table was a legendary figure, one of the world's 5 greatest swordsmen, the Sword Emperor Taiji, and the supreme leader of the Udon sect, Zhang He. Zhangzi stood nearby, watching to see how this insolent boy would conduct himself now in the face of such power. The sect leader scrutinized the young man with a piercing, all-seeing gaze, silently assessing his character. In vain did the old man try to discern the aura of a hidden martial arts master. Standing before him was an ordinary lay disciple, with the air of a wheeler-dealer ready to peddle a dubious insurance policy. Breaking the silence, the leader asked why Udon shouldn't buy salt at the Ichana market. Chansu was immediately seized by panic, and in a stammering voice, he tried to disavow what had been said, declaring his lack of involvement in the idea. The sect leader's face darkened. He sternly pressed the matter, asking if someone had really brought him a proposal that would derail a major deal, without a single piece of solid evidence to back it up. Huiyan realized that if he let Changsu keep stammering, then both of their cultivation centers would simply be destroyed. Taking a step forward and raising his hand, the young man calmly admitted that he was the one behind this initiative. The sect leader raised an eyebrow in bewilderment. He sternly remarked that it was not fitting for a lay disciple to interfere in intersect trade agreements. With a mere shrug, the young man retorted that he hadn't actually come to this hall of his own free will. Changsu nearly fainted, horrified by the boy's complete lack of self-preservation instinct. However, the elder was intrigued. Looking the young man straight in the eye, he demanded the truth. The leader pointed out that a discount from the Shanxi merchants came around only once a decade, and other great clans were already lining up for the goods. Why would some kid try to talk Udon out of such a lucrative deal? Standing at the other end of the table, Huiyan assured the elder that they actually had plenty of time. Folding his hands, he said he guaranteed that the largest trading giants, including the massive Huizhou alliance, wouldn't even lay a finger on this shipment. Frowning, the head demanded immediate proof. Meeting his gaze, Huiyang revealed that the son of Huizhou's very own merchant king was currently enrolled as an ordinary student at Udon. Mentioning the Yo clan, one of the 15 wealthiest clans in Huizhou, the young man suggested summoning a representative immediately. Changsu didn't need to be told twice. He bolted out of the room at top speed. After a few moments of tense silence, the doors slid open, revealing Yue Hongyang, who, looking extremely agitated, bowed deeply. Leaning back, the clan head asked the young man about the situation at the Yichang market. Caught off guard, Hongyang stumbled over his words. Though flustered, he nevertheless confirmed that the merchants from Huizhou had indeed decided to ignore the fair. The sect leader was stunned. After all, this was a massive market spanning 50 rows of stalls. Why on earth would they pass up such an opportunity? Hongyang explained that, as far as his father's business partners knew, none of the 15 Huizhou clans intended to get involved in the salt trade this month. This news was shocking. The refusal of the most powerful guild to accept discounted goods was a clear warning sign. The sect leader realized the full gravity of the situation. After dismissing Hongyang, who hurriedly closed the door behind him, The old man left Huiyan standing there with an extremely smug expression. To himself, the young man could only sigh, recalling an old parable told by his senior mentor, Changhua. He recalled his teacher's words, that a true master cannot look on indifferently as a child walks toward an open well. In essence, the young man was acting as a savior here, even if the Udang Financial Pavilion was a thorn in his side. To watch a great sect stride confidently toward a ruinous abyss that would cost thousands was more than the young man's merchant pride could bear. Widening his eyes, the sect leader stared intently at Hui Yun, wondering how mere disciples could know such things. With his trademark merchant smirk, the young man replied that a true pro never reveals his secrets. He advised the boss to cancel the pre-purchase and wait for prices to plummet. After sitting in silence for a while, the old man pushed back his chair and agreed to change his mind, canceling the deal. Chang Su sighed with relief, but the old man stunned them. He ordered them to take Huiyan and go to the market for salt anyway. Huiyan's jaw dropped. The young man exclaimed indignantly that the chief clearly hadn't understood anything. Buying salt right now remained a terrible idea because prices were about to drop. But the chief ignored the protest, placing his hand firmly on Chang Su's shoulder. Looking directly at Huiyan, the old man's eyes flashed with cunning calculation. A suffocating spiritual pressure filled the room once more, pinning Huiyang to the floor. He ordered the young man to go to the market in person and bring back a supply of salt for udon. But there was a catch. Since the boy had declared himself a genius of trade, he was obligated to drive the price below market value. Failure would result in severe punishment. Huiyang was overcome with indignation and cried out against the injustice, reminding them that the merchants of Shanxi were the most ruthless businessmen in Murim. How could he get them to offer a discount without any bargaining chips? Softening his tone, the leader explained the harsh reality of Udon's situation. The sect was involved in the salt trade, not to line its own pockets. The sect was obligated to ensure a stable supply of salt throughout Hubei, so purchases were made regardless of market conditions. But because of Huiyan's statements, Udon had missed out on the discount. The old man thought it fair to shift the responsibility and the new negotiations onto the young man's shoulders. He even hurt the young man's pride by questioning whether he possessed even basic negotiation skills. Huiyan was so offended that a vein in his forehead nearly burst. Beating his chest, the young man fumed. He'd given them invaluable advice worth thousands of silver coins for free. Yet they were forcing him to do the dirty work. He declared at the top of his lungs that he was a first-class merchant and didn't work for free. Stroking his beard, with a sly grin, the sect leader agreed that a worthy reward was indeed in order. He offered the young man a 1% commission on the total amount of savings negotiated. The gears in Huiyan's head instantly began turning. In his imagination, the beads of an abacus clicked into place. The boy immediately countered with a demand for 10%. The old man calmly raised the bar to 3. Huiyan demanded 8%, while Chang Su in the background made faces, amazed at the audacity of the boy haggling with the head of Udon himself. The old man's final offer was 5%. Leaping forward with his hand outstretched, the young man agreed to 5% as well. He crunched the numbers. 30 tributes for 10 silver coins, with a discount, 9. If he could get it below 9, he'd pocket 5% of the total savings. Grinning like a madman, the young man rejoiced that the windfall would go straight into his in-game account for purchases. As he ran out of the hall, he shouted to the old man that he must keep his sacred word. And so the sliding door slammed shut with a crash. Chan Su turned to the leader, asking if he was sure it was wise to entrust this madman with Udon's entire annual budget for salt. He also asked how the old man had learned of the boy's pathological greed. The abbot smirked and remarked that a true merchant would never pass up a golden opportunity to make a profit. Meanwhile, the boy was already racing across the courtyard, with a financial plan already formed in his mind. Several people were relaxing in the courtyard of the lay students. Sitting on the railing was Jian Su, Huiyan's wealthy friend, cheerfully playing a grass flute. Huiyang tumbled down the stairs, calling out loudly to Osu, who, completely baffled, asked why the young man was here instead of at the main residence. Bent over double and catching his breath, Huiyang desperately asked if anyone had direct connections with merchants from Shaanxi. After thinking it over, the disciples noted that the Shanxi people usually send their children to neighboring sects, something like Huashan, so no one turned out to have any connections. With a heavy sigh, Huiyang put his hands on his hips. The chances were slim, but it was worth a try. He explained that merchants from Shanxi travel to the Yichang market to sell salt. Osu merely shrugged, noting that it was quite natural for merchants to travel and sell salt. Clenching his fists, Huiyang feigned a grim expression. He announced to everyone present that the entire deal was a planned, large-scale scam. The disciples exchanged shocked glances, their carefree mood vanishing. The surge of anger made them wonder whether the merchants from the plains were seriously intent on profiting from the lands of Udon, and to do all this by exploiting salt, a basic necessity. The hot-headed students leaped onto the railings, clenching their fists and calling for the thieving scoundrels to be crushed immediately. Calmly watching them, with a smile, Huiyan thought that it was precisely because of things like this that concepts such as Shangxi merchants or Huijiao merchants came into being. In business, deception is commonplace. The golden rule is, the fool isn't the one who deceived, but the one who is taken in. However, when the merchants' native lands became the victim of deception, the situation changed dramatically. Even if, on the surface, merchants were chasing after hard cash, deep down, they harbored a genuine love for their homeland. And as soon as outsiders arrived with the aim of ruining their province, the local merchants were the first to rise to its defense. Huiyan knew deep down that 90% of the reason lay in the losses to his own wallet, but he didn't want to dampen the boy's heroic spirit. Osu turned to him, asking how exactly the Shanxi people planned to pull off such a large-scale scam. He added that people weren't stupid, and price gouging wasn't that easy. Before the young man could answer, the sound of boots echoed on the stone steps. Turning around, they saw Yo Hongyang, the secret heir to Huizhou, coming down the stairs and scratching his cheek. He politely asked Huiyan to give him a couple of minutes alone. The two of them walked down to a secluded corner. Heading toward a quiet corner of the vast grounds of the Udang Temple, the young men stopped. Freezing in place and hiding his face in the shadows, Hongyang asked the crucial question right off the bat. How did the other man know all this? Bowing his head, Huiyan played dumb and asked what he was even talking about. Hongyang got straight to the point. He wanted to know how the young man had found out about the imminent complete repeal of the Kaicheng salt law. The atmosphere instantly turned tense. Hongyang stared intently at him with an incredibly serious expression. Swallowing silently, Huiyan narrowed his eyes, realizing that his interlocutor was far more perceptive than he appeared. In Hongyang's mind, entire theories were forming about Huiyang's true nature. He suspected that Huiyang's facade as a lazy student of Huiyang was merely a brilliant cover, concealing the son of some elite merchant. In his opinion, Huiyang behaved discreetly so as not to attract greedy parasites by flaunting his wealth. He added that even high-ranking officials in Beijing were not fully aware of the confidential details regarding the salt reform. This led to the conclusion that the young man had a powerful political patron behind him, whom Hongyang asked to be introduced to. Maintaining a calm demeanor, Huiyang stated that he had no patron, but he immediately added a pithy piece of wisdom. A merchant's greatest weapon is neither the sword nor the tongue, but his secrets. After hesitating for a second and asking once more, was that his final answer? Hongyang burst out laughing, and all his seriousness evaporated. Wiping away a tear, he remarked with a smile that he had heard those very same words from his own father, the Merchant King, until his ears grew tired of hearing them. Shrugging, Huiyang thought that he had picked up quite a bit of wisdom from the Merchant King of Huizhou back in his previous life, long before his return through time. Quickly changing the subject, the young man asked if Hongyang, as a member of the Huizhou Union, intended to help him with the salt deal. Hongyang flatly refused, asking him not to count on him. When asked why, Hongyang explained that this deal had already been agreed upon by the elders of both merchants' guilds. The Huizhou merchants had officially agreed to turn a blind eye to the massive profits the Shanxi merchants would reap from the salt trade this time around. Sighing and resting his hand on his hip, Huiyan pretended to understand everything. Hongyang was impressed by how easily the young man grasped the complex political situation. Huiyan explained that in business, you have to give in order to receive. The Shanxi people had clearly given Huizhou something valuable in exchange for their silence. Narrowing his eyes, the young man flashed a shrewd look. For example, did they turn a blind eye to illegal smuggling by the merchants of Huizhou? Hongyang's face turned deathly pale, and he clutched his forehead, asking in utter shock how the young man could possibly know state secrets. Grabbing Huiyan by the shoulders, Hongyang brought his face close to the boys and desperately offered 10,000 liang of silver in exchange for information about his mysterious patron. Huiyan's mouth watered at the thought of 10,000 silver liang. He almost decided to confess to being a time traveler for the money, but pulled himself together just in time. Impressed, Hongyang decided that Huiyan was above bribery. Huiyan broke out in a cold sweat and asked for clarification. Would the merchants of Huizhou stay out of it? Hong Yang nodded, adding that in the market, one person's profit always means another's loss. Such is the law of commerce. But he was curious as to why Huiyong was so eager to thwart Shanxi. Huiyong admitted that the sect leader would punish him if he didn't secure a discount on salt. Hong Yang burst out laughing again, finding the story hilariously funny. He couldn't believe that, while explaining government policy, the young man had managed to infuriate the sect leader and gotten himself stuck with a commission on the deal. He asked what the plan was going forward, and he promised to keep everything a secret, staking his family's reputation on it. Smiling, Huiyun leaned toward Hong Yang's ear to whisper his grand plan to him. But before he could utter a word, a heavy, cold shadow fell over them. Turning around, they saw a burly, bald bully of a student on the stairs, grinning maliciously. Stepping forward, he declared that since juicy secrets were being shared here, he should get to listen in too. Hyun quartered the boys in Udon's courtyard, demanding they lay out all their plans. Rolling his eyes, Huion told him to get lost, since it was none of his business. The insolent man crossed his powerful arms and declared with a smirk that security at the festival had been entrusted to his men, which meant the matter concerned him directly. Looming over Huiyun, he threatened to spread a rumor of a conspiracy among the elders of Udon if the guys didn't talk. Huiyun was nervous on the inside. The threat sounded childish, but the last thing he needed was any extra attention on a time-traveling merchant. Before the young man could come up with anything, Yo Hong Yang, usually the quiet one in the sect, calmly stepped forward. The temperature around them seemed to drop below zero, and Hong Yang's former meekness had completely vanished. Looking the bully straight in the eye, he declared in a venomous tone that trade matters were the personal concern of the merchant king. Taking a step forward, the young man cast his shadow even over this burly man. He asked whether a nobody like him really thought he had the right to look down on the legendary Eo clan, and asked if Saigon Hyun was prepared to face the consequences. The bully's face contorted. He was drenched in cold sweat, literally frozen in place. It dawned on him that he had accidentally tried to extort money from the heir to the wealthiest merchant dynasty. Spinning on his heels, the hooligan retreated in disgrace, tail between his legs, a crushing defeat for the bald bastard. As soon as the man disappeared, Hong Yang's intimidating aura instantly dissipated. Rubbing his neck, the young man smiled innocently and laughed. He cheerfully remarked that he'd put enough pressure on the bully to keep him from bothering them for a long time. Huiyun's face showed complete bewilderment. Inside, he was amazed at how quickly this guy's personality had changed. Osu, who had just arrived, asked Huiyun for a specific plan of action, and the whole team leaned in toward each other, forming a secret circle in the middle of the courtyard. After hearing Huiyun's plan, Hong Yang smiled and called it a crazy risk, one that was, however, worth a try. Osu was practically jumping for joy, beaming and looking forward to the fun. Huiyun merely grinned predatorily, promising them a world of fun, and their victims a hopeless nightmare. The scene shifted to the bustling streets of Yichang. The annual fair was in full swing, ablaze with lanterns, stalls, and crowds of traveling merchants. Huiyun strolled through the crowd with a relaxed air, while the treasurer, Jiangsu, trailed behind him, covering his ears and complaining about the unbearable noise. Wincing at the din, Changsu shouted over the crowd, trying to find out where the salt market was. Huiyun casually replied that at such large fairs, popular commodities like salt were always located right in the heart of the market stalls. Stretching, the young man rejoiced at the chance to escape the boring confines of Udon. But Changsu grumbled that he was merely an apprentice, pretending to be a manager. Brushing it off, Huiyong advised him to stop worrying and enjoy the view of the city. Noticing the guarded mounds of grain and salt sacks ahead, Changsu asked what it meant. Surveying the mountain of white gold, Huiyun replied with a twinkle in his eye that the salt merchants ran the show in this entire neighborhood. Suddenly, they were spotted by a plump, wealthy man with a well-groomed ponytail and a haughty expression. It turned out to be Kang Sung, the chief representative of the Shaanxi Trade Union. Rubbing his hands together, he greeted Udon's treasurer loudly. After announcing that the requested security detail from Udon had arrived at the warehouses, the merchant, with a sly smirk, inquired about the treasurer's reasons for his personal visit. Remaining unflappable, Changsu stated his intention to purchase a year's supply of salt, noting that the refusal to pay in advance did not at all mean a refusal to buy. Smiling, Kang Sung folded his arms with the air of someone doing a great favor. Standing next to the salt barrels, he proudly announced that he would not knock a single coin off the official price. Moreover, they would have to pay a surcharge for canceling the original contract. His gaze made it abundantly clear. Udon needs the salt, so just pay up and don't complain. Jiangsu was at a loss for words. But then Huiyan intervened in the conversation, folding his arms behind his back. He pointed out that they would, after all, be buying at a price below market value. Raising an eyebrow, Kang Song asked a lowly servant how some manager could possibly know the intricacies of high-level trade. Huiyan merely smiled and replied that no merchant in the world gives discounts out of charity. Staring at Kang San, he declared that a sharp price drop by a monopolist always had a catch. His expression darkening and a sinister grin spreading across his face, the young man whispered about the imminent, complete repeal of the law on free salt trade. Jiangsu was stunned, shouting at the top of his lungs and demanding to know what on earth he was talking about. Grabbing the young man by the shoulders and shaking him, the treasurer shouted that repealing the system would cause salt prices across the country to plummet by more than half. As he shook the young man, he realized that Shanxi had been trying to pull a fast one on udon before the price collapse. Huiyan merely snorted, having assessed the treasurer's math. Turning around, Chang Su shot the merchant a look full of righteous anger. Breaking out in a sweat, Kang Seong waved his arms frantically, insisting that the repeal of the law was nothing more than a baseless rumor from Beijing. Stammering, he argued that there was no official decision from the court, which meant that the old rules were still in effect, and no overpayment had been made. However, Huiyan surprised everyone by nodding and agreeing that the merchant was right. Straightening his clothes, the young man added that since the law had not been officially repealed, Kang Song was indeed selling everything at the current legal price. Kang Seong breathed a sigh of relief, but Jiangsu continued to seethe with anger, grumbling that the merchants could at least have warned Udon about a possible change. Turning away, Huiyan walked off, cutting him off by saying that openly spreading rumors about the court's decisions carried the risk of severe punishment. He added that it was any merchant's duty to sell goods if a buyer was willing to overpay. The treasurer nearly had a heart attack from rage. Glancing at the panicked merchant, Huiyang asked if there really was nothing that could be done yet. The merchant nodded frantically. The young man suggested that the treasurer leave. Huiyang slowly walked away, leaving the bewildered Changsu standing in the mud. As he walked through the market, Changsu nearly stamped his feet in frustration, wondering what Huiyang had been thinking. If the system were abolished, the drop in prices would cost Udon thousands of silver coins. The treasurer sternly demanded to know why Huiyan hadn't said a word about this secret discovery of the center before they had even left the mountain. Huiyan merely looked at him innocently and stated that Changsu had been far too carried away with his role as a polite and pleasant customer and was about to hand over their entire budget to the merchant on a silver platter. The young man explained that thanks to the treasurer playing the good cop, the merchant would remember him as an incredibly pleasant and loyal customer. At the same time, Huiyang himself played the role of a notorious scoundrel who knew other people's secrets, thereby ensuring that during the actual negotiations, the merchant would desperately try to strike a deal with him specifically. Soon, the two of them sat down at a table in a street snack bar. With a satisfied look on his face, Huiyan ordered a huge plate of hot buns and began to explain his business strategy in detail. However, he didn't get to finish his thought. Jiangsu's heavy fist flew at full speed straight into the young man's head, knocking a stream of saliva out of his mouth. After taking a sip of tea, Jiangsu grumbled. This was a disciplinary measure of the highest order, since the guy had a once-in-a-century talent for making people want to punch him in the face. Rubbing the back of his head, Huiyan remarked, "The master knows how to put the enemy in his place." The treasurer smirked, calling him a minor nuisance. When the treasurer asked about their plans for the rest of the time, he received a calm reply. They wouldn't be doing anything. The fair lasts 4 days. All they needed was patience. Jiangsu asked in bewilderment what on earth they were supposed to do for a full 4 days. Rising from his seat, Huiyan suggested taking a stroll through the market, when he suddenly froze, staring at one of the stalls in the distance. This stall was completely covered with brightly colored skewers of caramelized fruit, tanhulu. The young man's face lit up with delight, like a child who just won a prize, and he excitedly pumped his fist. The treasurer stared at him with a completely lifeless and utterly exhausted expression. Clenching his fists, Jiangsu realized with horror that the boy's latest crazy scheme was already in full swing. The scene shifted to an upscale textile shop, crammed to the brim with bright and expensive silk fabrics. The merchant rubbed his hands together eagerly, and boasted proudly that all of his merchandise had received the highest quality certification from the market manager himself. Huiyan, with a knowing look, thoughtfully ran his fingers over the smooth silk. Lifting a roll of green fabric, he confirmed that the workmanship was indeed of the highest caliber. After that, the young man politely asked permission to look around a little longer. The shopkeeper broke into a broad smile and began assuring him that there was no one in the entire city who could match him in terms of quality. Chief Treasurer Jiang Su stood behind him with the look of a husband who'd been forced to spend 3 hours wandering through women's shops. He was completely drained. The elder grumbled discontentedly, asking if they were really going to wander around the fair all day and threatening to go back to the inn to sleep. Huiyang turned around and asked if his companion had noticed a hidden pattern in the layout of this market. Jiang Su merely raised an eyebrow skeptically. When asked what exactly he was supposed to have noticed, Huiyang began to explain the structure of the local hierarchy in detail. The market manager was a high-ranking official who wielded unlimited authority during the fair. Every good brought into the city was required to undergo inspection by his inspectors and was assigned one of 3 grades: lowest, medium, or highest. Based on this assessment, the manager allocated stalls. First-class goods were given the busiest spots, while low-grade goods were pushed into dark alleys. Typically, a corrupt administrator would take huge bribes to falsely classify cheap junk as top grade and assign it the best spot. However, after crouching down to assess the situation, Huiyun noted that things were radically different in Yicheng. By all accounts, the local official was incredibly competent. He had a keen eye for true craftsmanship and categorically refused to trade official status for bribes. Approaching the weapons display, Huiyang picked up an elegant sword in a heavy black scabbard. Holding the weapon out to Jiang Su, the young man asked to buy the blade. The treasurer narrowed his eyes, immediately recognizing that they were looking at an insanely expensive piece of craftsmanship. The young man merely smiled cheerfully and urged him to view this purchase as a necessary investment in the upcoming salt negotiations. With a heavy sigh, Jiang Su reached into his wallet. He counted out several heavy silver coins and poured them into the young man's outstretched palms. Huiyan was practically whistling with joy, lovingly clutching his new toy to his chest, while the treasurer glared at him from behind. Turning around, the young man asked the older man a rather cunning question. He inquired whether the older man agreed that the local governor was honest, competent, and despised corruption, to which Jiang Su slowly nodded. Then Huiyan pointed out one crucial contradiction. The weapons shop where they had just purchased this masterpiece occupied a prime location, even though the shop itself was mediocre and mixed high-quality goods with mass-market items. To maximize tax revenue, an honest official would have had to grant such a high-traffic location to the city's best weapons guild. Wondering why the official had made such an unprofitable and biased decision, Huiyun grinned slyly and menacingly. Tapping the scabbard, the young man explained that the clue lay in the name of the blacksmith who had forged this weapon. After examining the blade, Jiang Su acknowledged the high quality of the workmanship, but didn't understand what the master's name had to do with it. Peering closely at the fine engraving near the guard, he narrowed his eyes. Carved into the bright metal was the name Li Weizong. Huiyan explained that this man was a legendary blacksmith who was currently working in the imperial capital itself, Beijing. But the most remarkable fact, as the young man emphasized, pointing his finger downward, was that the blacksmith had been born and raised right here in Yicheng. It finally dawned on the treasurer what the young man was getting at. The incorruptible administrator was simply showing blatant favoritism and patronage toward the local merchants. In response, Huiyan merely shrugged, noting that harboring special feelings for and showing leniency toward one's fellow countrymen was an entirely human trait. It was precisely because of this patriotism that the sword crafted by the master from Ichan was the perfect gift. The official's keen intuition would allow him to immediately appreciate the high craftsmanship and reputation of his fellow townsmen. It was a flawless bribe, one that was impossible to refuse. Jiang Su was left speechless by the fact that, how could a righteous disciple of Udon be so brazen as to plan to bribe an official? He simply stared silently at the boy. The scene shifted to the market manager's majestic 3-story mansion. In the exquisitely decorated reception room, laden with tea and mooncakes, the official welcomed the guests, noting that it was a tremendous honor for him to host Udong's treasurer. Taking the sword that was presented to him, the official examined the blade with childlike delight, instantly recognizing the handiwork of the great master. Gasping in awe, he spoke of the blacksmith's fame in the capital, and added that such a gift must have cost Udon a fortune. Jiangsu kept the conversation going, smiling and saying that they had merely wanted to show their respect. Seizing the initiative at once, Huion leaned forward with a predatory smirk. The young man got straight to the point, speaking of the imminent drop in salt prices and the abolition of the Gaizang system. The official's face darkened instantly. He urged them not to worry, assuring them that he had already called the local brokers to order. The brokers, natives of Yichang, would never allow outsiders to ruin the region's economy. The administrator smiled and assured Udon that he had absolutely nothing to worry about. A shadow fell across Huion's face, and a sinister, triumphant smirk spread across his lips. The system of trading brokers functioned as follows. The brokers served as key intermediaries between visiting merchants and local buyers. Since dialects, traditions, and units of measurement varied from place to place, it was the brokers who smoothed out these differences to ensure fair trade. However, if they wanted to make life difficult for a particular merchant, the brokers could easily rig the scales, delay the issuance of paperwork, and completely block sales. Under normal circumstances, the wealthy merchants from Shanxi would have tried to bribe them. But when the administrator himself took a hard line against the exploitative outsiders, bribery was out of the question. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. The door burst open, and a servant anxiously reported that a wealthy merchant was causing a wild commotion in the courtyard over market conditions. With a heavy sigh, the official apologized to his guests and asked them to make themselves comfortable while he settled the matter. The wooden doors closed with a soft click. Huion whistled a tune casually, looking completely relaxed. Jiangsu glared at him angrily, trying to figure out why he had even let slip the secret salt law to the secular students. The young man explained that he simply shouldn't have been blabbing about it openly in public, since it was a state secret. However, after eating a cookie, he said there was nothing wrong with discreetly passing on the information through trusted channels. He pointed out that many of Udon's secular apprentices were heirs to wealthy merchant clans, making them an invaluable intelligence network. As soon as the young man hinted to Ozu and Hongyan about the price crash, the entire local merchants guild closed ranks to defend their profits. Pouring himself some warm tea, Huion admitted that even he hadn't expected such a lightning-fast reaction from the brokers. Taking a sip, he muttered with annoyance that if he'd known in advance, he would have spent the money on a fancy dinner instead of a sword. Suddenly, a deafening crash rang out from the courtyard. Jiangsu's expression instantly turned stern. Rising to his feet, the treasurer ordered Huion to follow him. Frowning grimly, the elder added that things seemed to have gone completely off script. Both of them ran out of the building and rushed down the stone steps. As they ran, Huion asked why his mood had suddenly changed. Jiangsu merely nodded toward the gate. Shielding his eyes from the sun with his hand, the young man peered into the distance in bewilderment. His gaze fell on the raging crowd. Clicking his tongue in annoyance, the young man sighed heavily. He couldn't believe that this troublesome misunderstanding had erupted right here. Watching the instigators of the disturbance, Jiangsu asked if they were thugs from some shadowy sect. Huion replied that despite their scoundrel-like appearance, they belonged to a highly respected and virtuous clan. When Jiangsu asked how he knew this, the young man explained that he had spotted an incredibly familiar face in the crowd. One that was just begging to be punched. Standing at the gate among the shouting merchants was the huge, bald bully, Sa Gonhyung, wearing a smug, triumphant smirk. He recalled how Sa Gonhyung had fled the Udon Academy in disgrace after being humiliated by Yo Hongyang and his bodyguards. Seeing the immense wealth and influence of the merchant king's son, this power-hungry bully simply couldn't bear such humiliation. Huion could only sigh, lamenting his catastrophic bad luck. Of all the mercenary clans in the world, the salt merchants from Shenxi had hired this very bald con artist. Meanwhile, the Shaanxi representative, Kong Song, was yelling at the market manager, demanding that he mind his own business. He protested that even if the brokers were protecting the local merchants, blocking the salt deals meant a complete ban on business. The manager stood his ground and calmly asked why an honest official would dishonestly interfere with their trade. Giving the merchant a stern look, he demanded concrete evidence of corruption, warning him of the consequences for insulting an official. Kang Song realized that the law had backed him into a corner. Gritting his teeth, the merchant turned to Sa Gonhyun and declared that since Shenxi had connections, they would deal with the middlemen themselves, and the innocent and the guilty would be judged later. Huion stood in the shadow of the doorway, squinting as he listened to the merchant's insolent remarks. Taking a leisurely step forward, the young man urged them not to rush. Stepping into the middle of the courtyard and placing his hands on his hips, the young man pointed out that if Shenxi simply forced its way through, the local merchants of Yichang would suffer a total loss. With a sly smirk, he suggested that the merchants from Shenxi play by the rules and cooperate with the brokers. Kang Song's eyes widened when he recognized Hui Yan, and he growled that this was the very same suspicious student of Udong who had promised to buy up all their salt for a song. In response, Hui Yan simply threw up his hands, declaring that he had nothing to do with market prices. With a smile, the young man added that he was speaking not on behalf of Udong's military forces, but as a simple merchant who respected honest business practices. After that, Hui Yan gave a lecture on economics. He reminded them of the merchant's code regarding fair profit. It was unacceptable to dump depreciating salt based on insider information from Beijing. Kang Xiang nearly exploded with rage, but Sagon Hyun placed his heavy hand on his shoulder, urging him to calm down. Glaring maliciously at Hui Yan, the bald man remarked that merchants had their own laws for resolving disputes. Smirking, he asked the merchant to step aside, since he had been hired precisely to resolve the matter by force. Slowly removing his hand from the merchant's shoulder, the bully took a step forward. Cracking his neck with a confident air, the merchant proposed settling the conflict with a traditional duel between representatives. The scene shifted back to the tower of the Sisa market regulator. Hui Yan's smirk grew even wider. He agreed immediately, suggesting they begin the duel right then and there, in the presence of the manager and the brokers. Jiang Su stood behind him in complete shock, watching as the young man willingly got himself into a fight with a trained fighter. The treasurer frantically tried to understand exactly what this trading duel meant. The essence of this method of dispute resolution was as follows. A duel between representatives was used when the empire's laws could not clearly distinguish between the innocent and the guilty. Instead of lengthy court proceedings, the guild settled disputes through the force of hired guards. And for merchants, power was always measured in the jingle of coins. The wealthy could easily hire the strongest martial arts masters. This is how large alliances drove out smaller competitors. However, Hui Yan faced a serious problem. Having spent all his savings on stats, he didn't have a penny left for mercenaries. He had to rely solely on himself. Sa Gonhyun and the merchant exchanged whispers, realizing that Hui Yan couldn't draw Udon's elite into a street fight. Stepping closer, Jiang Su cleared his throat and quietly warned the young man. He said bluntly that it wasn't worth counting on help from his superiors. Turning to the merchant, the treasurer reiterated that Udon strictly avoids interfering in worldly affairs. That was precisely why the clan would not take part in the duel. Kang Song smirked, agreeing that it was unbecoming of noble warriors to stoop to street fights. Glancing at the burly, bald man, the merchant boasted that Shenxi had arranged the best security in advance. The governor asked Hui Yan with concern whether they should stall for time to find a mercenary. The young man merely smirked and waved his hand. Straightening up proudly, he declared that, as a merchant, he had personally accepted this challenge. Sa Gonhyun's face darkened with rage. With a psychopathic grin, he admitted that ever since their days at the academy, he'd dreamed of breaking the young man's bones. Looking down at his feet, Hui Yan calmly replied that this was wonderful. Beating the giant with his finger, the young man invited him to show everything he was capable of. However, just before the fight was about to begin, a gruff voice rang out, calling out to Sa Gonhyun as the young leader. A bearded warrior in brown robes entered the courtyard. It was Hall leader Hong Mun Hak of the School of the Rising Thunder. He explained anxiously that he had come to test the young master. The warrior offered to fight him personally, since no one could stand up to his authority. However, Sa Gonhyun merely snorted, noting that Hui Yan had almost no inner chi. Why use a butcher's axe on just some little chick? Hui Yan smirked and taunted the bully, asking if he'd decided to back out of fear. Enraged, Sa Gonhyun shouted that he would never pass up the chance to beat up the young man himself. The official whispered to Hui Yan, asking if he was sure of his decision. After all, standing before him was the heir to a martial arts school, not just some street thug. With a confident smile, Hui Yan remarked that it would be tough against a veteran, but dealing with this bald con artist would be a piece of cake. Sighing, the steward bowed his head and accepted the choice. Stepping into the center of the courtyard, he loudly announced the official terms of the duel. The losing side was obligated to submit completely to the winner. If Sa Gonhyun won, Shinxi would gain the right to trade freely without brokers. If Hui Yan won, Shinxi would unquestioningly obey the rules of Yichang. Raising his hand, the steward made sure there were no objections. The duel between the representatives began. Hui Yan instantly lunged forward, kicking up clouds of dust with his boot. He smiled, recalling their previous fight. That time, he had let his opponent strike first, but in this fight, the initiative was everything. The young man threw a punch, but a massive executioner blocked his path with a clang. Sa Gonhyun swung his broad blade, and Huiyong barely managed to leap back out of the way of the deadly slashing blow. Outraged, Huiyong glared at his opponent, shouting, "Where did you pull that giant sword from?" and calling it brazen cheating. Bursting into laughter, the bald man declared that no one had banned weapons, and that this hunk of iron had always been his signature weapon. Leaping up, he brought the blade down from above, shouting that he'd strike with the flat of the blade so the young man wouldn't accidentally kick the bucket. As he landed, the opponent added sarcastically that if the young man wasn't satisfied with something, he should have brought his own sword. Huiyan broke out in a cold sweat, turning pale from the powerful gust of wind. The bald bastard landed another incredibly powerful horizontal strike. Retreating frantically, he remembered that he had never really held a sword in his hands his entire life. The heavy blade crashed into the stone slabs with a thunderous roar, splitting them and sending shards flying. The merchant from Shangxi shouted joyfully from the sidelines, urging Sa Ganhyun to break every bone in the insolent man's body. The concerned steward asked Jiang Su if they should stop the duel, but Jiang Su merely folded his arms calmly across his chest, replying that the young man had brought it upon himself. Besides, Udon's intervention would mean defeat in the negotiations. Sighing, the treasurer casually added that Huiyan was also one of Udong's trained disciples. Sa Ganhyun soared into the air once more, raising his blade above his head with veins bulging on his face. The sword crashed down with a deafening clang, raising a cloud of dust, and Huiyan barely managed to roll out of the way. Breathing heavily, the young man slid backward on his knees, trying to put some distance between them. Resting his weapon on his shoulder, the bully cackled, asking if running away was really the only thing they taught at Udon. He mockingly called Huiyan a rat running through a maze. Standing up and brushing off his clothes, the young man asked in surprise what on earth this fool was babbling about. He pointed out that he'd been practicing martial arts for less than a year, so Sa Ganhyun should be ashamed of failing to land a single accurate hit. Smiling, the young man added, if that level of skill was considered normal for a young headmaster, then the Rising Thunder School left much to be desired. Sa Ganhyun's face flushed crimson with rage, though deep down, Huiyan was breaking out in a cold sweat. He recalled that during the exam, he hadn't managed to land a single hit on his bald opponent. If he'd relied solely on his nimble footwork, he would have kept dodging, only to eventually take a hit and lose. However, at that moment, the situation had changed. His gaze grew harsher, and the bully, his ego wounded, clenched his teeth even tighter. His bearded senior, Hong Moon Hak, shouted at him to control himself, but the bully couldn't hear a thing anymore. He lunged forward, kicking the stone slabs to pieces in blind rage. With a wild scream, Sa Ganhyun delivered a deadly vertical strike. However, Huiyan quickly dodged it. Sa Ganhyun was taken aback by the surprise. Clenching his fist, the young man concentrated a powerful surge of spiritual energy. A system screen flashed in his mind, displaying the purchased skill, Robust Constitution. A cheap skill, purchased for 2 lanas of silver to help him survive beatings, was about to prove its worth in full. Covering the distance in a split second, the young man landed a crushing hook right on his opponent's jaw. Sa Ganhyun's eyes rolled back, and saliva spurted from his mouth. The powerful counterpunch sent him into a deep knockout. The entire crowd, Jiangsu, the merchant, and Hong Moon Hak, froze with their mouths agape in silent shock. Sa Ganhyun collapsed unconscious onto the stone slabs. His heavy-handed executioner fell beside him with a clang. It was a clean knockout with a single blow. Huiyan flexed his fist. A sturdy build is powerless against masters of precision strikes, but against the strong man Sa Ganhyun, it allowed me to win without a single scratch. Turning to the shocked crowd, the young man dusted off his hands and asked if they would continue the match. Recovering from the shock, the steward grabbed Huiyan's hand and raised it triumphantly, declaring him the winner. Glancing at the pale-faced merchant, he declared that Shenxi would no longer be able to oppress the locals and must abide by the rules of Yichang. A few days later, a clear blue sky shone over the peaceful mountain peaks of Udong. In the main hall of Udong, Huiyan and Jiangsu presented the final report, confirming the successful completion of the salt deal. The head of the school stared at the final records in amazement, unable to believe his eyes. Looking at Huiyan, he remarked in a trembling voice that the young man had managed to save Udong an incredible 300 liang of silver. Huiyan stood there with a satisfied smile, fully understanding the market. The merchants from Shangxi could not afford to haul 500 sacks of unsold salt back north. In the end, they had to grit their teeth, submit to the local brokers in Yichang, and sell the salt at a huge discount. which is what brought Udong a profit of 300 liang. Stroking his beard, the head of the school nodded and confirmed that, as promised, he would pay Huiyun his 5% commission, which amounted to exactly 15 liang of silver. Upon receiving the heavy purse of coins, the young man practically kissed it. The headmaster's expression turned serious. He noted that although Sa Gon-hyung was the same age as Huiyun, he was a respected young head of a martial arts school, so defeating him without a single scratch was a source of pride. Glancing at Jiang Su, the head announced that, contrary to all established customs, he planned to grant Huiyun an exceptional privilege. Jiang Su's eyes widened in panic. Pointing his finger at Huiyun, the headmaster proudly proclaimed that, as of that day, he was officially accepting him into the ranks of Udong's esteemed inner disciples. Huiyun's face instantly darkened. The head of the school continued his speech, boasting that it had been nearly 50 years since a lay disciple had been promoted to the inner sect. With a warm smile, he urged Huiyun to take boundless pride in becoming an elite monastic member of the great Udon school. Huiyun's jaw clenched as tight as it could go. Taking a slow, heavy breath, the young man asked if the abbot would first agree to grant his one request. With a wave of his hand, the head of the school promised to do absolutely everything in his power. Huiyun pressed his hand to his chest with a loud thud. Looking the great master straight in the eye, he asked to be expelled from the school immediately, without destroying his dantian. The scene shifted to a picturesque view of the quiet Udong forest, where birds chirped peacefully. Back in the office, the headmaster could be seen standing in a state of complete bewilderment due to a temporary short circuit in his brain. Jiang Su stood behind them, clutching his head in utter shame at the young man's complete lack of self-preservation instinct. Stammering, the headmaster began to ask why on earth the young man was so eager to leave the greatest sword school in the world. Huiyun calmly replied that he simply wanted to make money. Striking a proud, heroic pose, the young man declared with absolute confidence that he was crazy about money. Pressing his palm to his face, the headmaster sighed heavily, noting that although a Taoist should stay away from worldly greed, earning a living was not a sin in itself. However, he pointed out a problem. Huiyong had mastered the Blue Cloud step. In Murim, no school would ever let a student who had learned their secret arts leave. The standard practice for protecting intellectual property was the physical destruction of the dantian, or, at the very least, severing the tendons in the legs to prevent the use of those techniques. Tapping his fingers on the table, the headmaster admitted that he was completely baffled, for he had never before encountered boys begging to be expelled for the sake of a career as merchants. Covering his face and peeking through his fingers, the headmaster tried to find a compromise. Glancing at Huiyun, he asked how the boy would feel about a very unique, ancient solution. Raising a finger, the headmaster sternly uttered the name of this status. Registered secular student. The protagonist's eyes widened. Huiyun tilted his head, looking quite puzzled. Registered? The headmaster explained the historical details. Usually, all of Udon's resident students had their monastic names entered into the sacred registry scroll of the Hall of Ancestors, a tradition dating back to the time of the founders. Thanks to this official record, they were considered registered, which granted them the same educational rights and prestige as resident students. But according to the compromise, Huiyun would undergo the registration ceremony while formally remaining a lay student. He noted that, although it sounded unusual, this dual system had its precedents. Over a century ago, when the demonic cult gained strength and ravaged the lands, the righteous sects suffered enormous losses. Udon and the great clans created the lay rank to quickly train the wealthy and protect their business empires. Huiyun broke out in a cold sweat. He realized that this story was already a good 100 years old. The abbot outlined the conditions. A registered secular disciple had the right to study Udon's highest martial arts, but was obligated to report immediately upon being summoned in times of crisis. Giving Huiyun a stern look, the head emphasized that there was no coercion involved. Huiyun stood silently, his eyes wide as he realized the colossal economic benefits. Mentally, he was literally squealing with delight, realizing just how exploitative and lucrative a loophole existed in this world. As a registered secular disciple, he could use Udon's renowned name to protect his trade caravans throughout the country without spending a dime on security. He could hang Udon's flag over his shops, offering special discounts and instantly attracting thousands of loyal customers. He could even sell cheap wooden talismans and souvenirs under the sacred brand, making money out of thin air through marketing. At the same time, the young man retained the full freedom of a secular merchant and the right to study elite martial arts for self-defense. The perfect corporate loophole. His mouth was watering just thinking about it. The young man quickly cleared his throat, trying to hide a greedy smirk. And immediately, he urgently asked the head to do him this favor and enroll him. However, the abbot said that originally this service was only available during the rise of the demonic sect, and warned that the proposal still needed to be brought before the Council of Elders, and gave Huiyan a strict deadline, counting on his fingers. He had 3 months to prove his professional aptitude. He had to demonstrate to the council both his business acumen and his combat skills, so that the elders would have no objections. If he failed after 3 months, the choice was simple: either become a monk in the inner sector for good, or destroy his dantian and set off in all 4 directions. Huiyan's smile froze when he realized just how risky the gamble was. However, the young man never backed down from a lucrative deal. Clenching his fist, he accepted the terms with a confident smirk, and the abbot closed his eyes, accepting the protagonist's decision. The scene shifted to the training grounds, near a giant stone slab, and then even further closer to the clan houses, near which stood the incredibly handsome master, Changhua, smiling strangely. He cheerfully welcomed Huiyan back, congratulating him on his legendary performance in Yichang. At that moment, Huiyan was hauling a heavy stone slab on his back, and his legs trembled at Chenghua's praise of his extraordinary combat talent. Smiling, Changhua remarked that Huiyan was destined to become Udong's greatest inner disciple. In his mind, Huiyan was breaking out in a cold sweat, glad he'd kept the details of his worldly status a secret, for it was hard to even imagine what kind of scene that senior troll would have caused had he learned the truth. With a deafening crash, the young man dropped a heavy boulder onto the ground. Gasping for air, he sank to his knees and counted his sets. This was the 20th set he had completed. Changhua nodded, amazed by such rapid physical adaptation, recalling that previously the student had barely been able to budge the slab. Changhua announced that the physical foundation had finally been laid, which meant it was time to move on to full-fledged sword training. Huiyan was delighted, thinking that the constant hauling of cobblestones was finally over. However, he realized that to prove his worth to the Council of Elders, he would need to demonstrate both financial strength and mastery of the sword. He already had a brilliant plan in place for the business side of things, but proving his talent in fencing was quite another challenge, since his training had only just begun. Upon his return, Changhua held a simple wooden training sword in his hands. Huiyan stood up straight, ready to finally experience the legendary sword arts of the great Udong school. But before the young man could strike a dramatic pose, Chenghua's wooden blade came crashing down on the back of his head with a loud crack. Rubbing the bruised spot, Huiyan cried out in pain. Changhua remarked with a smile that his student had too many distracting thoughts and raised the wooden sword. Today they would begin the 3 elements method. Huiyan's jaw dropped in utter disappointment. He pointed out that the 3 elements style was a basic, cheap technique sold on every street corner for 3 copper coins. The young man pressed further, asking if this was really the very same unrivaled art he had been promised. Changhua just chuckled, pointing at him and assuring him that he would teach him a style of an entirely different level. When Huiyan asked what the difference was, Changhua broke into a smile and replied, "You'll have to figure that out for yourself through persistent training." With a heavy sigh, Huiyan complained about his mentor's vague teaching style. However, Changhua merely pointed out his student's lack of understanding. He asked Huiyan if he knew even the basic forms of the standard 3-element style. Nodding, Huiyan explained that, within the scope of basic knowledge, the style consists of 3 simple strikes. Mount Tai crushes the summit for the vertical chopping strike, Wind and Rain from all sides for the diagonal strike, and Confusion of 1,000 warriors for a horizontal strike. Changhua smiled, and his gaze toward the sun grew sharp. He told Huiyan that since the form was known, it was time to begin practicing. He was to practice each form exactly 10,000 times. Such was the special training for the 3-element sword method. The number 10,000 left the young man utterly bewildered. But Changhua explained that all the other students on the main mountain had gone through the same thing. The master merely advised the young man to focus solely on completing the required number of repetitions as quickly as possible. Without listening any further, the instructor spun around abruptly and rushed off, promising to return a little later. He slipped away right in front of the young man, who barely had time to raise his hand. Hui-yun froze with his wooden sword lowered. But instead of getting discouraged, the young man decided to simply brush off his troubles and stay in good spirits. He decided he just needed to complete the required number of repetitions, and to do so, he planned to perform the swings without putting in too much effort. Trying to stay positive despite the grueling training, the young man gripped the wooden sword and raised it above his head for the first strike. A clear goal appeared before his mind's eye. He needed to make 10,000 vertical, horizontal, and diagonal swings to complete the task. After the very first movement, the counter for remaining swings dropped to 29,999. The boy's face betrayed immense tension. His teeth were clenched. Inside, he cursed everything under the sun, agonizingly trying to estimate how many endless hours these 10,000 swings would take. Meanwhile, on a nearby branch, two little birds chirped carefree, paying absolutely no attention to the young student's torment. With a loud thud against the stone floor, the wooden sword fell from his weakened hands, signaling that the boy had finally given up and could go no further. Hui-yun collapsed onto the stone slabs, exhausted and breathing heavily. He could hardly believe he'd met the standard, and for the first time, he realized just how difficult the training was. Sitting on the floor with a wry smile, the young man came to the conclusion that even the simplest repetitive exercises required at least a certain amount of natural aptitude. Even the simplest three-element style required concentration. Performing 10,000 correct sword swings had become a grueling ordeal. His body was constantly tensing up, and his form kept falling apart due to his complete lack of sword fighting skills. With only 2 purchased talents, he could barely maintain the full range of motion. Glancing at the panel of cheap skills, the young man realized with bitterness that he couldn't master the technique. And suddenly, right next to him, a special offer materialized completely out of the blue. The system offered a sword talent for 20 coins at a discount. For 1,000 repetitions of the stance, they gave a 50% discount. Hui-yun exhaled. Without it, he couldn't buy the skill. For a moment, his thoughts turned to memories of the Yichang market, where he had honestly earned his 15 liang of silver, which he now had to spend. He thought with annoyance that 2/3 of all the money he'd earned through hard work would go right here, toward purchasing this talent. Still, gripping the hilt of his wooden sword more firmly, the young man decided that this investment would give him at least some chance of success. Even with lazy swings, the counter kept ticking. After completing 1,000 strikes and purchasing the fencing talent, Hui-yun decided to put it to the test. Summoning all his willpower, Hui-yun delivered a sharp and incredibly powerful slashing strike that seemed to cleave the air around him. The difference in power after purchasing the skill astonished the young man. He was thrilled. Even the weakest talent had radically transformed his basic strike. Suddenly, he realized that the real test lay ahead. He had to complete all 10,000 repetitions. The young man began to doubt whether this made any sense for his progress. Master Cheng Hua, standing on a raised platform, watched his student's clumsy efforts with a slight smile, assessing his initial progress. Standing at the edge of the tiled roof, the senior instructor watched his student's every move, expecting him to make the right decisions. At first, Cheng Hua praised the boy's diligence, but as soon as the master looked away, the lazy student went back to his silly pranks. Master Cheng Hua sighed heavily, seeing how easily the boy got distracted. The mentor didn't know what to do with his careless student. Hearing the master's stern rebuke, Hui-yun suddenly froze and stared at him in surprise. Cheng Hua declared that slacking off was unacceptable, even without supervision. Stepping closer, the master said this was going too far. The boy, in shock, asked if the master had been watching him, to which the master expressed concern about his training. Cheng Hua covered his face with his hand in irritation, casually mentioning the upcoming evaluation match among the students. Puzzled, the young man asked his mentor to explain what kind of evaluation match he was talking about. Master Cheng Hua immediately peeked out from behind his hand with a smile, seeing that the student had taken the bait. The master explained that he was referring to sparring matches among the third-generation students. These were designed to test their skills and foster healthy competition. Cheng Hua, staring intently at the student, asked if his competitive spirit had been awakened. The young man's expression clearly showed a complete lack of enthusiasm for the upcoming sparring matches. With poorly concealed theatrical irony, Hui-yun assured his mentor that he was literally burning with passion for combat. The young man asked whether the elders would be watching the matches. The mentor suggested that the senior monks wanted to see Udon's future with their own eyes. Upon hearing this, the young man immediately decided that this was the perfect moment to demonstrate his fighting skills. He loudly declared his desire to participate in the tournament. However, Changhua instantly and categorically quashed all attempts to sign up. Hui Yong exclaimed indignantly, asking if the reason was really that he was older than the other students. Changhua refused to listen to excuses and struck the student on the head with a precise blow from his wooden sword. The instructor stated sternly that to participate, one must have mastered the three-element style to perfection. Sighing heavily, Hui Yong realized that 10,000 swings were inevitable. The young man finally asked for the specific date of the start of the qualifying competitions at Udong. Changhua intently counted the remaining days in his head. The master announced that there was about a month left until the start of the competition. The thought of having to perform 10,000 swings in just 1 month weighed heavily on the young man's shoulders. Although the task was achievable, Huion doubted that repeated sword swings alone would be sufficient for the test. Changhua once again felt mixed emotions as he observed his student's unconventional thoughts. The student's performance on the training ground depended heavily on his mood. The master mentally acknowledged that the young man's vertical strike wasn't half bad. However, immediately afterward, the student would start acting in completely strange and inexplicable ways. It seemed as though Huion was simply incapable of concentrating on a single thing for very long. Left without proper supervision, this student could easily stray onto the wrong path in his training. The boy suddenly cried out as his instructor's wooden sword once again struck his back with a ringing clang. Changhua insisted that the boy take his training seriously. Hui Yang turned indignantly to the master, demanding an explanation for his latest blow. The mentor declared that empty swings were useless and offered to correct the technique. The boy countered that he could handle it himself. Changhua began teaching him the basics of proper foot placement, shoulder width apart. The master advised him to concentrate his internal strength in the dantian and hold the sword easily and freely. Concluding the instruction, Changhua commanded his student to strike with a single, smooth motion. The wooden blade cut through the air with a loud whistle, precisely following the command received from its mentor. The young man's eyes widened with the sudden realization of the correct technique for performing a basic strike. Even with his acquired sword talent, this movement was completely different from anything he had done before. The guy suddenly had an epiphany about the true meaning and technique of swordsmanship. He glanced cautiously and furtively at his mentor, waiting for his reaction to his success. Changhua asked him with a wicked smile if he still wanted to swing his sword around haphazardly. The guy just chuckled with displeasure and resentment, completely admitting his defeat in this argument. In complete surrender, Hui Yang gave his mentor the right to do with him absolutely whatever he wanted. Exactly 1 month later, the picturesque mountains of Udan greeted a new dawn, illuminating the temple buildings. The guy, exhausted to the limit, sat powerless on the stone floor, breathing heavily and intermittently. Changhua noticed that despite the grueling training, his student looked quite cheerful. Changhua asked Hui Yang if he'd finished his warm-up. He cheekily replied that he hadn't yet and asked to come back in half an hour. The mentor dryly remarked, "There's no time for jokes. Time to take up the sword." Hearing the order, Hui Yang theatrically drawled that he obeyed. The protagonist noted to himself that Changhua was, without a doubt, an extraordinary person. He understood that the master had plenty of other students. However, for the 5th day in a row, the mentor remained by his side and personally taught him. Hui Yang wondered if Changhua was trying to earn back his investment, or if there was some other hidden reason for this guardianship. Suddenly, the master's demanding cry rang out, urging him to finally start swinging and not just fly in the clouds. Hui Yang began to object that he was already doing this and urged the elder not to rush him. At the same time, Hui Yang realized that it was this mentor who pushed him to master the sword. Shifting heavily from foot to foot, the boy concentrated on adjusting his grip on the wooden handle, squeezing his fingers tighter. Master Chenghua's gaze became sharp and attentive. He closely watched the young man's every movement. Mustering his strength, Hui Yang raised his training sword high above his head and prepared to strike. The boy promised that the results of his exhausting efforts would not be long in coming. With a powerful exhalation, the wooden blade whistled through the air, delivering a powerful vertical blow. The young man's eyes were filled with utmost concentration. He was completely immersed in the process of executing the strike. Hui Yan's body quickly turned around, and he delivered a sharp horizontal slash into the air. His clothes and hair fluttered in the wind from his sharp and rapid movements. Finishing the combo, Hui Young brought his sword down with force, performing a diagonal strike. Finally, the guy stopped and, breathing heavily, lowered the training weapon down. Nevertheless, he raised his sword again and began to wait for the verdict of his stern mentor. Hui Young turned towards the master with a satisfied and slightly smug grin. However, Changhua's face remained completely calm and did not show any emotion. The master coldly asked the young man what exactly he was staring at so intently. The guy exhaled in surprise. Was that all? And began to wait for verbal praise. Hui Young asked in confusion if his mentor had any other words for him, but he simply sighed and calmly replied that he was joking, but noted that his base had now truly become strong and decent. Changhua solemnly stated that Hui Young had changed greatly. The master noticed that even alone, the boy trained without distraction. To this, the guy briefly replied that he had simply been suddenly overcome by some kind of inspiration. Hui Young asked if he was good enough for the evaluation match, but the mentor only chuckled thoughtfully. Changhua announced that they would now have to conduct one final verification test. Hui Young, confused, asked what kind of verification test this was. The test required the boy to endure 10 blows from his mentor with a wooden sword. The master leaned forward. His hand reached out to the ground and confidently picked up a small, dry branch. Changhua announced that he was going to use this particular branch for the final check, and so the student and teacher took their starting positions on the wide stone parade ground. Master Changhua smiled and picked up a dry branch and asked if his student was ready to begin the duel. His eyes became intensely focused, and his body instantly tensed before a swift lunge. Hui Young nodded briefly, confirming his understanding of the test conditions. The first exchange of blows was lightning fast, sparks flying all around. The master's branch easily stopped Hui Young's attack. Changhua noted that the boy had imposed his own tempo, a good tactical move. However, the elder immediately noted that such a technique only works with approximately equal skill levels. The second blow struck with incredible force, and the air around them shook from the powerful collision. The mentor jumped and moved with incredible speed in the air, holding a branch. Hui Young struggled to maintain his balance as he prepared for his master's attack. Another blow from the branch hit the guy's body with incredible speed, causing him to bend over, defending himself with a wooden sword. Changhua raised the branch again and announced that it was time for the second round of exchange of blows. The boy hissed in annoyance. His opponent wouldn't slow down out of pity. Hui Young realized that if he relaxed even for a second, he'd get hit. Nevertheless, he began to guess what kind of test his cunning mentor had in mind. The diagonal strike, 8-directed storm technique was executed by Changhua with filigree precision. Following it was horizontal strike, confusion of 1,000 warriors cutting through the air. Finally, the vertical strike, Mount Tai crushing the peak collapsed from above with crushing force. Changhua demonstrated the 3 techniques of the school with astonishing ease. Soaring into the air, the master looked like a soaring bird. Hui Young realized this was a test of his mastery of the 3-element style. The 10th blow was approaching, his last chance to prove himself. By blocking this final blow, he would pass the test. Master Chenghua's gaze remained calm, but there was a sense of utmost concentration in it. He began to move with incredible speed and easily twirled the branch in his hand and grinned contentedly, anticipating the end of the duel. He warned the boy not to dare freeze just because there was one last blow left. Master Chenghua's eyes flashed with a steely glint as he raised the branch for the finishing blow. The boy cried out in panic, trying to prevent a surprise attack that was against the rule. The use of variable technology at the very last moment was a blatant violation of the agreement. A powerful blow followed. However, his reaction was so fast that the branch broke, and even Changhua was slightly surprised by such defense, because a strong blow threw the guy back. Despite this, he still held the hilt of his wooden sword tightly, ready to continue the fight. Hui Young asked hopefully if successfully defending against 10 of the master's blows would count towards his score. The boy tried to prove that he had successfully stood up to such a formidable opponent as Changhua. But the master only struck him again, and he asked a counter-question. Would he be as confident if he had a real blade in his hands? The main character noted with frustration that there wasn't enough time. Hui Young clenched his fist in despair. He needed a little more time to adapt. Changhua let out a satisfied sigh, closing his eyes and completely relaxing after the fight. The mentor declared that even if Hui Young had passed the test, he wouldn't have been able to participate. The boy sat on the floor, confused, processing the news. Changhua simply shook his hand, and the broken branch fell easily to the ground. ending the test. Master Chenghua looked at the boy with a slight smile, expecting him to understand the situation correctly. In a firm and calm voice, the elder announced the main restriction. Only internal disciples were allowed to participate in the competition. Hui Young sat in complete shock, not understanding why they were telling him about this only now. The scene changed abruptly, and they approached a majestic building with a traditional roof and red lanterns. The students and master sat down on the wooden steps, and Hui Young sadly lowered his head onto his hand. The mentor asked with a grin if the boy had stopped being offended. The resentment had burst forth. His energy had been wasted by the vague explanations. The master guessed the reason for his depression and asked directly if it was because of the ban on competition. Chenghua explained that only disciples from the main mountain were allowed to compete, and the boy's secular status closed the door. He noted with a smile that Hui Young had misunderstood everything himself, and now he was angry. The boy glared at him with irritation, feeling betrayed, and added with bitter irony that the mentor would always have an answer. Hui Young asked in bewilderment why the mentor had brought him to the training ground, and added bitterly that, according to the master, he would not be able to get into the tournament anyway. The mentor knew about the boy's confidence after mastering the three-element style, and reproached him for being too dismissive towards the third-generation students. Hui Young immediately retorted that it was actually his mentor who was underestimating him, and asked if Chenghua really believed that he would lose to these youngsters. The mentor turned his gaze towards the arena, completely ignoring the boy's emotional tirade. Chenghua ordered that the third-generation disciple sparring in the arena be closely monitored. The master explained that this child was the main hope of the entire school student body. The distinctive features of this talent were honesty and absolute straightforwardness in actions. Chenghua noted that despite its simplicity, his defense had absolutely no weak points. The young fighter rose into the air and with one powerful movement knocked the sword out of the hands of another student. Landing, he raised his blade to mark the end of the fight, and his opponent fell to the ground with a dull thud. His fingers gripped the hilt of the wooden sword tightly, and he inserted the sword into the sheath. Chenghua confided that the fighter was a direct disciple of the headmaster. The master proudly added that he was considered the greatest talent of the third generation, and named the warrior Myung-il. The notice board clearly displayed a sign declaring Myung-il's undisputed victory. After leaving the arena, both headed towards the exit, immersed in their own thoughts. Chenghua asked the guy for his opinion on the skill of the fighter he had just seen. Hui Young had to admit that Myung-il's skills and technique were truly amazing. The boy realized that his opponent's swordplay and footwork were at an unmatched level. He realized with bitterness that this gap could not be made up for with regular training. It would take him several years of hard work to even approach such mastery. Hui Young touched his chin thoughtfully, trying to find a way out. A thought occurred to him about the ancient system of registered lay disciples, and why the master so desperately clings to it and not to the inner disciple. Mentor Chenghua looked at the boy silently, his silence indicating he was deep in thought. Chenghua declared that to gain the elder's recognition, he would have to defeat such a fighter. The young man realized he had no choice. He had to take risks, even if the odds were slim. There was simply no other way to prove his worth in the time remaining. However, something else surprised him. Hui Young asked in surprise how the mentor could have known about his need for recognition. The master stood in the bright light. His figure seemed mysterious. Chenghua asked with a slight grin if the guy really thought he could hide anything. The master learned everything from the headmaster, who spoke of this strange undertaking. Hui Young objected, saying that the headmaster himself had offered him the status of a lay disciple. Chenghua assured the boy that he was prepared to make every concession. Covering his face with his hand, the mentor admitted that Hui Young's talent would be beneficial to Udon in any case. He added that Hui Young himself understands this perfectly well, although he tries to pretend that he doesn't realize it. Chenghua stated outright that in his current state, the boy would not be able to defeat a fighter like Myung-il. The master emphasized that Hui Young has potential, but his age is far from young to begin training. If his talent does not surpass Myung-il's abilities, the elders will not make exceptions for him. In that case, the boy would simply become a disciple from the main mountain, and the mentor asked about his future plans. Hui Young grimly admitted he simply had no choice. His fist clenched, and he pounded his chest resolutely, bracing himself for the inevitable. He would have to truly destroy his dantian and leave the walls of the Udon school forever. The boy's face expressed extreme determination. Chenghua listened to this statement with his mouth slightly open. The mentor lowered his chin with a slight sigh, considering what he had heard from his protege. He noted with respect how strong and unwavering the character of this student was. Changhua remarked that any outsider might think that trading was his true calling. Huiyang agreed that such a remark was not without merit. However, he didn't want to destroy his dantian. The master looked at the boy in surprise, his face expressing slight confusion. Huiyang explained with a smile that for a true merchant, money is the basis of existence. Changhua, perplexed, asked what the young man was trying to say. Huiyang casually spread his hands, making it clear that it wasn't a big deal. Gold coins swirled around the boy, symbolizing his main goal. He reminded his mentor of the 100 copper coins he had once borrowed, and, clutching a bamboo scroll, asked if it was time to repay the debt. After some time, Huiyang sat on a bench, thoughtfully looking at the bamboo scroll of the store. He mentally tallied his assets, just 6 silver coins. He stared at his modest savings with mild disappointment, clearly dissatisfied with their size. He remembered that out of the 15 silver coins he had received from the chief, 10 had already been spent. There were only 5 left, plus some small change that I managed to scrape together with difficulty. Changhua had to return another 100 coins for the herbal whistles, but that didn't solve the problem. Huiyang sadly concluded that even with everything together, it wouldn't amount to even 1 silver coin. He understood that with this money, he needed to create a trump card to defeat Myung-il. The realization of this difficulty weighed heavily on him. Any worthwhile martial art or talent required a fortune. Cheapness would be of no use in a fight, and Changhua merely stared at the seated Huiyang. The mentor extended his hand forward, as if trying to find a way to help this poor student. Huiyang held a small leather pouch in his hands, which he clutched hopefully. He looked up and stared at his mentor in surprise. Changhua explained that these were the 100 coins the boy had left with him for safekeeping. The mentor added that the rest was interest for keeping these coins with him. The bag turned out to contain a surprising amount of silver. The boy, shocked, asked again how such a sum could have been obtained from a few copper coins. He turned to Changhua, trying to understand why he was giving him such a fortune. The mentor stood nearby, his hands behind his back, and looked into the distance. Changhua reminded him that he had already warned him that it was unlikely that he would be able to defeat Myung-il, and if he lost, his dantian would be destroyed. Huiyang continued to stand there, confused, realizing the complexity and risk of his situation. The open leather pouch gleamed dully in the light, and inside it lay a whole heap of copper and silver coins, which Changhua handed to his student as a gesture of generous compensation. Master Changhua noticed that the bag should contain about 100 silver coins, and advised using this amount as startup capital for future trading activities. Gigi, with a touch of irony, asked whether too much wealth had accumulated in the hands of one Taoist from Udon, since this contradicted the ascetic traditions of the school. Changhua, slightly squinting, added that this was in fact his entire personal fortune, which he had accumulated over many years of wandering. The elder explained that during his travels, the people he had saved often sent him money. Changhua secretly saved it, and over time, it accumulated to a considerable sum. The master sighed and complained that now even selling herbal whistles to junior disciples had added to his rank, so he found a way to get rid of them. Changhua grabbed the strings of the bag tightly with both hands and shook it vigorously, demonstrating the weight and clanking sound of the contents. The guy looked away with a slight grin and said that he felt sorry for his mentor, but that didn't mean he would return the money that was already in his hands. Changhua looked at Huiyang with a smile and noted that he expected such an answer from him, and then asked how he was feeling. The master reminded him that money for a merchant is like food and water. The apprentice nodded. He felt a surge of energy and was ready to move on. Huiyang broke into a satisfied grin and loudly exclaimed that he now felt within himself the strength of an entire tiger, capable of moving mountains. Several days passed, and against the backdrop of majestic mountains and a traditional wall with a gate, a morning scene unfolded. A sharp impact sounded across the stone slabs of the training ground, and a wooden sword collided with another weapon with force, creating a shower of sparks. The next moment, the legs in dark boots with metal overlays quickly took a stand. The wooden blade described a wide arc, and its edge struck the projectile with a ringing sound. The opponent, wearing a white uniform with a black yin-yang symbol on his chest, was masterfully practicing his strike. It was Myung-il. Then some other guy came up to him and clapped his hands. At first, the fighter didn't pay any attention to it, still holding the wooden sword in his hands. But then I couldn't ignore it. and lowered my weapon, turning back. It was Hui Young who approached Myung-il and remarked that he had seen him during the evaluation match. But up close, this man looked even more impressive and confident. Myung-il put his fist to his chin with slight bewilderment and measured the guy with an appraising look, clearly wondering what he wanted. Clarifying his status, Hui Young introduced himself as a temporary disciple of the main sect and announced that he had come here specifically to spar with Myung-il. Myung-il turned around and coldly told him to leave, as he needed to focus on his own training and not be distracted by outsiders. Hearing the refusal, Hui Young, however, had no intention of leaving and remained standing in place with a slight smile, clearly intending to insist on his own. He decided to tease him and asked him if he was just going to give up. Hui Young stated that at the moment he needed to gain the elder's recognition, and if his opponent himself admitted defeat, he would only be happy. The guy grinned and added that there was no need to worry too much because if he chickened out, he wouldn't spread rumors about his cowardice. Gigi came closer to him and with a slight grin pointed out the age difference between them, noting that he completely understood why his opponent might feel afraid. Hui Young tilted his head to the side and looked at Myung-il with a smile, waiting to see what he would do. Myung-il's face twisted in barely contained anger as he realized that this insolent guy wasn't going to back down. Myung-il turned to the instructor standing at the edge of the arena and asked him to act as a referee for the upcoming fight. The instructor, a respectable man, agreed, and Myung-il exhaled heavily. And then he turned to the main character and said that he would clearly regret his decision to bully him. Hui Young had the same smile on his face, and he said that this would decide the fight. After some time, the referee loudly announced that the fight was starting and asked both fighters to take their starting positions in the middle of the training arena. Hui Young, standing on the stone slabs with a wooden sword in his hands, nodded with concentration, confirming his complete readiness to begin the battle. Myung-il, frozen in a fighting stance with an intense gaze, also replied that he was fully prepared for the fight and did not intend to give in. The judge glanced at the prepared fighters and, having made sure of their readiness, with a loud shout, the instructor announced the start of the fight, and both opponents instantly began to move, rushing towards each other. A sharp whistle was heard in the air, and the wooden swords collided with a dull sound, knocking out a sheaf of small chips and creating a powerful shockwave. Myung-il, bending down to the very floor, took a low, almost animal-like stance. This is how he prepared for a lightning attack on the main character. A hand in a white wrapping tightly gripped the wooden handle. A loud cracking sound echoed through the air as Myung-il's sword struck hard from below, and his wooden sword collided with Hui Young's weapon. Hui Young parried the attack with difficulty. The simple but devastating blow showed that his speed advantage was rapidly faded. If this continues, defeat will become inevitable, and he will lose this fight in disgrace. Hui Young desperately tried to think of some way out, realizing that at the current pace, he had no chance. The boy noticed that Myung-il had studied his movements and was reading every step. Hui Young was struggling to fight back, and the enemy was unaware of his true strength. But what if you suddenly acquired a new talent right now that would change the course of the battle? After all, no one can simply transform in the middle of a fight, and this would be a complete surprise for the opponent. Hui Young mentally put all his energy into activating his new talent, hoping it would overwhelm Myung-il. The guy spent every last coin, leaving himself not a penny for the future, for this chance. Quickly tumbling through the air, Hui Young headed straight for Myung-il, preparing to strike. With a fierce grin, he prepared to counterattack, confident that his new talent would work at the right moment. However, Myung-il's gaze, which slid over his figure, made it clear that he was still in control of the situation. But suddenly, a warning appeared in front of Hui Young that he had exceeded the limit of equipable talents. The scene changed. Two students stood in the gallery, watching the fight from the upper tier, and one of them shook his head in surprise. The student at the railing was perplexed as to why Myung-il had agreed to this duel. The disparity in strength was obvious, and the move seemed like a foolish provocation. The second disciple noticed Myung-il's growing tension. Rumors of a lay disciple, Hui Young, challenging the powerful irritated him. Myung-il, the headmaster's disciple and heir to the Taiji sword, was under pressure. He was disgusted even to be compared to a worldly upstart. Or perhaps the reason was that Myung-il felt threatened by this impudent guy. Everyone knew Myung-il sincerely revered Changhua. Envy of the attention his mentor paid to Hui Young only further wounded his pride. Changhua had been focused on Hui Young's training for the past few days. Myung-il's motives remained a mystery, and his actions seemed illogical. Hui Young, still in shock due to the skill's usage limit, was unable to dodge the attack and was sent flying backwards. Myung-il, deftly seizing the initiative, delivered a swift blow and sent the guy rolling across the stone slabs. Turning around, the student in the white uniform said that he expected this from a simple layman. He did not know the basics at all. The main character himself said that it was a new move called the lazy donkey roll. However, a thought flashed through his mind that he had never seen such a strange bamboo scroll. The system again issued a warning about the need to purchase an additional talent slot or replace one of the existing ones. The boy exclaimed disconsolately that he'd spent every penny of his money. Hui-young added indignantly, "The system demands new purchases from empty pockets." There was a sharp sound of footsteps, and the air filled with tension before another exchange of blows. Myung-il charged forward, his wooden sword sweeping in a wide arc, forcing the boy to retreat. Hui-young realized with frustration that talents could be purchased, but the slots were limited. He scolded himself for planning to stock up on cheap talents for a quick boost. The boy resolutely extended his hand and realized that he had no choice but to act. Hui-young decided to unequip his equipped talent, Nimble Moves, to free up a slot. He aimed for the 100 silver Swift Move skill and equipped it. Blue lines glowed around Hui-young, and a predatory smile lit up his face. His body felt incredibly light, and it was worth every 100 tael. Myung-il, noticing the change, crouched down and prepared to counterattack, assessing his new opponent. Hui-young wanted to get the hang of the skill, but there was no time. He knew Myung-il wouldn't give him a second to warm up and would immediately start pressing. The guy decided that in that case, he'd have to go full speed from the start. Hui-young's feet kicked off the floor hard, and he soared into the air, making an incredibly fast turn. Landing, Hui-young pressed his face against the stone slabs. Myung-il was surprised and barely had time to follow his lightning-fast movement. Myung-il's face showed slight confusion as he tried to understand the reason for the sudden acceleration. Two other students stood in the gallery, watching the duel unfold from above with interest. The younger brother assumed his older brother had acted hastily and foolishly. The young observer turned to Myung-sung, hoping for support. He, in turn, could not hide his surprise at the incredible speed that the guy demonstrated. The junior student's eyes widened in shock when he realized that Hui-young's movements were almost imperceptible. He admitted that tripping on level ground was funny, but this speed exceeded his expectations. In the arena, Hui-young put his finger to his lips as Myung-sung mentally wondered what had happened to him in the last few moments. A sharp determination appeared in his gaze, and he again prepared himself for another dash forward. With a whistle, Myung-il's wooden sword cut through the air, but Hui-young no longer moved away, avoiding a collision. The opponent in white had difficulty containing his emotions and was surprised to note that the guy had been hiding his powers all this time. Hui-young countered with a grin. Myung-il was hiding his true skill. He was shocked that his opponent couldn't keep up even at his speed limit. The two fighters met again in the center of the arena, and their wooden swords collided with a deafening roar. After this powerful blow, Myung-il flew back and suspiciously wondered if Hui-young had been checking him out this whole time. He had to admit that the boy's incredible speed completely explained his overconfident demeanor. Only blurred traces of Hui-young's rapid movements as he circled his opponent remained on the stone slabs. Myung-il gritted his teeth as the main character attacked and stated that if this was the speed limit, he could still win. He thought he had simply lost his rhythm and was forced to admit that Gigi was demonstrating a completely different level of speed. He straightened up and looked at Hui-young, trying to understand the secret of his explosive growth. But the white fighter quickly pulled himself together. He was Udon's chief disciple and had no right to lose. Then the main character dashed forward again, leaving behind only a blurry trail. The student in the white uniform tensed up, and memories came flooding into his head. He remembered how Changhua approached him and asked Myung-il with a smile how his training was going. Remembering his mentor, Myung-il raised his sword again and vowed that he would never give in to any worldly disciple. The next moment, he rushed forward, intending to prove his superiority, but the guy had already slipped away from the attack. Myung-il, breathing heavily, glared at Hui-young with hatred, accusing him of hiding his true strength. Hui-young moved at an even greater speed, and Myung-il noticed that his words about his maximum speed were now a lie. The wooden swords collided again with a deafening crack, and the impact sent small fragments flying across the stone floor. Myung-il lost control of himself and was unable to block the blow, wincing in pain. The younger students standing in the gallery looked at each other in amazement, not believing their eyes. A worldly student had defeated their main mountain talent. The white fighter lay prostrate on the stone slabs, his wooden sword lying nearby, knocked out of his hands by a powerful blow. The blue-robed referee firmly declared the sparring over and raised his hand, signaling the end of the match. The instructor loudly proclaimed lay student Hui-young the winner. Myung-il, having come to his senses, raised his head with difficulty and squeezed out of himself that Hui-young was a liar because he did not use his full speed. Clutching his head, he exclaimed in despair that it was a real scam because Hui-young had hidden his abilities. The boy closed his eyes, tilted his head back slightly, and took a deep breath, giving himself a minute to recover and apologized for what happened, but noted that adults are always full of tricks. The next day arrived, and the bright sun rose over the Udon Mountains, illuminating the ancient buildings and stone walls. Chenghua, standing in front of Hui-young, asked him in bewilderment what he had done to be able to defeat Myung-il. The mentor tried to extract the secret to defeating Myung-il. Hui-young merely shrugged. He was simply stronger. That was the whole secret. Chenghua, hearing this answer, only stared at the guy silently, not knowing what to say to such a bold statement. Finally, the mentor exhaled heavily and put his hand to his face, remarked that victory was victory, and suggested leaving everything as is. Removing his hand from his face, Chenghua looked at the boy intently and asked what he planned to do next after this sensational victory. Hui-young's victory over Myung-il sent shockwaves through Udon High School. Even the elders were forced to acknowledge the mundane boy's fighting prowess. But Chenghua warned that one victory is not enough for the status of a student. If Hui-young has anything else to surprise the council with, it's better to show it now. The young man assured his mentor with a smile that there was no cause for alarm. The plan was ready. Hui-young decided to prove not only his strength, but also his business acumen. Chenghua chuckled. Proving business acumen was harder than winning a fight. But the boy frowned and countered. He had his own reasons. Hui-young added that he simply needed to temporarily borrow the famous name of the Udon school for his trading plans. Chenghua, narrowing his eyes skeptically, looked at the boy with obvious distrust. The guy clapped his hands and enthusiastically exclaimed that, after all, he had something to offer, and it wasn't that difficult. Hui-young, after thinking for a moment, got down to business and asked if the mentor would like to start a business together with him. Chenghua admitted, his voice hesitant, that he wasn't sure about the idea. Behind him stood an arch with a sign leading to the official meeting hall. Suddenly, Zhang Su appeared before them and expressed his disapproval of the idea of the Udon school acting as a guarantor and intermediary in trade transactions. Hui-young, without any embarrassment, stated directly that such a scheme would definitely bring profit, and his confidence was unshakable. Zhang Su narrowed his eyes. Direct deals were more profitable than intermediaries. Why overpay merchants when they could negotiate without the need for extra mouths to feed? Hui-young smiled and retorted that the elder was only saying that because he didn't know how hard life was for small merchants in the Central Plains. According to him, for people who do not have martial arts, these lands represent a real hell, full of dangers. The young man reminded them that merchants live in constant fear of robbery. Hui-young emphasized that it is precisely these risks that make their lives a struggle for survival. He asked a rhetorical question. What if the Udon school intervened and provided protection for the caravans? Hui-young added that a reputable school would protect the goods for a fee, and Udon would reap the rewards, the reputation and honor of the public defenders. When the elder asked about the merchants' benefits, Hui-young replied that they would gain security. Storage in a warehouse and delivery on request cost money. The guy added with a satisfied grin that on top of all this, a commission is charged for each transaction. Zhang Su scratched his head with a puzzled look, while the boy spread his arms, exclaiming about a win-win situation for everyone, and the elder was forced to admit that it was feasible. The headmaster froze in doubt, sweat breaking out on his forehead. He asked if this plan, perfect on paper, would work in practice. Days later, clouds floated across the sky, signaling change. The flag of the Wudong mediation was raised on a pole. The work had officially begun. An impressive crowd of merchants and commoners gathered in front of the building with this flag, creating an unprecedented excitement in the area. Two elders, including the head of the school and the head of finance, stood on the street, watching the lively trading. The headmaster, with a surprised sigh, stated that things were going much better than he had initially expected. He paused a little and clarified that only a little more than 10 days had passed. But had this venture brought in any real income? His gaze fell on the abacus, and Zhang Su mentally began to calculate the preliminary revenue for the past period. A coin flashed in the air and fell, and the head of the school was astonished to hear that the profit was about 200 silver liang. He immediately did the calculations in his mind. 200 liang in 10 days meant about 600 liang a month, which was simply unbelievable. Converted into salt, this amounted to a full 1,800 sacks, a figure that staggered the imagination with its immensity. The flag fluttered in the wind again. The headmaster turned to Jiangsu and asked if this business idea really belonged to Hui Young, to which he received an affirmative answer. He admitted that he had initially been quite skeptical about the idea, but now his opinion had changed dramatically. He added that the guy definitely had a rare talent for making money, and suggested that they go inside, where an important guest was already waiting for them. The headmaster turned and headed toward the entrance, gesturing for the others to follow him into the building. A traditional gazebo stood on the shore of a picturesque pond. In the pavilion, a merchant in purple joyfully clasped his hands in greeting, thanking the school's headmaster for his support. The Huizhou Guild representative, Song Young-ui, beamed with joy. He explained that thanks to udon, merchants could finally trade without fear of being robbed, and this would take Hubei province to a new level. The headmaster, slightly surprised, asked again. The merchant fervently assured that this was so, and sincerely hoped for the continuation of this cooperation for many years. The head of the school replied with a serious expression that they intended to support this business for as long as possible. The merchant leaned forward slightly and announced that the Huizhou Guild had prepared a small, modest gift for the school as a token of their gratitude. He pulled back the lid of the wooden chest, and a mysterious round sphere glowed inside on the blue fabric. The headmaster's eyes widened as he recognized it as the legendary Heavenly King pill that had only been rumored. In the past, the Heavenly King sect, shrouded in mystery, hid in the wilderness near Lake Qinghai, remaining unknown to the outside world. 10 years ago, the sect suddenly disappeared, and the reasons for its collapse were shrouded in mystery. A brutal, bloody battle erupted over the remaining treasures, with people clashing to the death with swords. Throngs of adventurers flocked there for the legendary Heavenly King's pill, reserved only for the descendants of the sect's founders. Rumor had it that its power rivaled that of the great Shaolin elixir, but for 10 years, no one had been able to find it. The wooden chest containing the pill sank into the lake's waters, and it seemed its location was lost forever. The merchant, closing his eyes, explained that, unfortunately, he could not reveal how they managed to obtain this priceless artifact. However, he added that no matter the circumstances, if this gift helps grow another great pillar in the Central Plains, it will be a blessing for everyone. The merchant insistently asked the head of the school to accept the gift without the slightest hesitation, emphasizing its importance. The headmaster, after a moment's thought, admitted that they did not usually accept such gifts, but the future of the young students was always his primary concern. He accepted the gift, appreciating the sincerity of the Huizhou Guild. The merchant enthusiastically replied that he was infinitely grateful for the acceptance of the valuable gift. The headmaster shook his head and exhaled. He hadn't expected such a turn of events. Hui Young's initiative had had a profoundly positive impact on the people. The head of the school was noticeably looking forward to today's meeting of the Council of Elders. The day of the council arrived, and the majestic Samchon Hall opened its doors for the important meeting. Once inside, Hui Young noted with irony that he visited this hall much more often than in his past life. The elders gathered around a long table. The headmaster opened the meeting with a grin, and Hui Young froze before the elders. Something he had never seen before, even in his past life. His gaze fell on one of the people sitting there, Chun Yu, and the boy wondered why he was there. It immediately dawned on him that this man was the elder of Udon, and if he had known earlier, he would not have put so much pressure on him. The idea that he had extorted 2 silver liang by means of a staged accident began to seem rather reckless to him. One of the elders with a thick beard cleared his throat loudly, attracting the attention of everyone present. The headmaster officially announced that the council would begin, and the question of granting Hui Young the status of a registered lay student would be decided. He then invited everyone to express their opinions. The first to stand up was Chun Yu, who loudly declared that he was categorically against granting such a status to this student. The elder acknowledged the outstanding abilities of the student, Muk Hui Yang, but objected distributing such statuses would create a bad precedent. Another elder objected, saying that the status wouldn't harm one person. The one in the center reminded them that the system had only been introduced because of a demonic cult. He explained that this could cause the monks on the main mountain to become envious of worldly freedom, and the lay disciples to desire the secret techniques of Udon. Another elder remarked that no one would forcibly restrain a student who wanted to leave. The argument flared up again, as the boy's talent was too great to be let go so easily. From the opposite side, a question was asked. Since when has Hudon been clinging to just one talented student? Unable to withstand the argument, the head abruptly ended the debate and announced that it was time to move on to a vote. He rubbed his face tiredly with his hand, a tangle of thoughts swirling around his head, and before he began voting, he noticed that the advice concerned the future of Hui Young himself. The chief's gaze fell on the boy, and he gave him one last chance to convince the elders. The leader addressed him directly, asking if he had anything he wanted to say before the council. Hui Young stood up straight, hands clasped behind his back, and looked confidently at everyone gathered. Having briefly replied that he was ready, he smiled decisively and added that he was tired of listening to other people's arguments, so it was time for his own word. He stepped forward with firm confidence. Hui Young had sold an incredible amount of goods in his past life, so this situation was perfect for him. He clapped his hands sharply, attracting everyone's attention, and loudly declared that he couldn't just give up. The boy loudly addressed the elders and, with a respectful bow, declared that he was not going to sell himself like a commodity, waiting for someone else's assessment. The council of elders sat on either side of the long table, looking intently at the young man standing before them. Hui Young calmly stated that everyone present was well aware of his recent achievements. The guy recalled that having defeated Myung-il, the greatest talent of the Myung generation, he proved his combat worth and his abilities. He pointed to an open brokerage business that was projected to bring in 600 liang a month, demonstrating his business acumen. The elders exchanged confused glances, shocked by the high revenue. One recalled Chunyu's words about routine success, but the numbers spoke for themselves. However, Hui Young noted that such success was only possible due to his current position as a lay disciple. If he becomes a monk of the main mountain, he will lose the right to engage in trade, and his commercial talent will be wasted. If he's expelled from the school without status, his dantian will be destroyed, and his martial talent will also be useless. Hui Young gripped the hilt of his sword and declared that he desired to achieve greatness in both fields, martial and commercial. He explained that there was only one path to this goal. This path is to preserve his freedom and master the martial arts of the main mountain. Only with this status will he achieve his goals and reveal his full talent. He pointed out that his demonstrated abilities were only a small part of what he could offer. Hui Young assured the elders that he would continue to grow and develop further if given the chance. The young elder exclaimed in amazement, realizing the scale of his ambition. The advisor added, "Udon has nurtured many masters, but no one has ever nurtured two such talents at once." The young man urged them to imagine the glory his success would bring to Udon, and emphasized that it would benefit not only the school, but the entire economy and ordinary people. The young man finished his persuasive speech to the council and politely thanked the elders for their attention. One of the elders in the hall chuckled softly, looking thoughtful as he considered what he had heard. Some argued that Udon's commercial acumen wasn't worth clinging to. However, even such arguments couldn't negate the obvious benefit such talent would bring to the school. The headmaster chuckled softly, assessing the situation in the hall. He addressed the assembled group with an important air and proposed moving on to the decisive vote. Following the leader's order, the elders supporting the decision began raising their hands. One by one, the venerable masters expressed their agreement, and the number of raised hands rapidly increased. Only Chunyu sat with his hand down. He was clearly in the minority. Soon, almost everyone present raised their hands, confirming their agreement with the headmaster's proposal. Hui Young stood in front of the table. The scene fell silent, and all eyes turned to the man who would deliver the final verdict. The headmaster made a decision and announced that Udon would officially accept Hui Young as a registered lay student. This unique status allowed him to study martial arts while maintaining the complete freedom of a layman. The boy could hardly believe it. He had achieved his goal. In his hands lay a tablet with hieroglyphs, confirmation of his status, and long-awaited recognition in Udon. At that moment, his mentor, Chenghua, appeared from the side, watching his protege's reaction with a slight grin. Chenghua looked at the jubilant Hui Young with slight confusion. The master merely remarked that he was stuck between the monks and the lay people. He asked the student if he would feel lonely in such an uncertain position. The boy answered without hesitation. He doesn't feel lonely at all. On the contrary, freedom only brought him joy. Hui Young declared with a smile that he had always dreamed of studying without being tied to the mountain. Freedom was more precious to him than peace. Chenghua listened silently to his student's fiery speech, and only briefly replied that he understood his position. The master added that since the boy had become his official direct disciple, he was obligated to call him his mentor. Hui Young immediately accepted this. Chenghua also reminded that his other direct students should be called senior martial arts brothers. The boy looked curiously at the two students standing next to the master and began to figure out how to address them. The younger of the two was Myung-jin, who was still considered senior to the newcomer in terms of seniority. The teacher ordered Hui-young to immediately address them with the proper honorifics according to etiquette. Hui-young, taken aback, asked again if he needed to do it right now, in front of everyone present. Hui-young sighed heavily, collected his thoughts, and awkwardly began an attempt to address his new acquaintances. His voice was not loud enough, so the mentor demanded that he speak louder and clearer. Hui-young, feeling the awkwardness of the situation, sighed again and quietly squeezed out the address of senior martial arts brother. The guy, mentally cursing everything in the world, raised his head and defiantly shouted out the required address. He folded his hands in greeting and called out loudly to his elders. Chunghwa nodded with satisfaction. The student's voice now sounded just right. Hui-young realized with surprise that all this time he had no idea how to get out of such a stupid situation. However, having experience from his past life behind him, he knew that the only way to escape was to play along with the teacher. With a sigh of relief, Hui-young accepted his new role. In the world of trade, money talks, and he leaned back, feeling at ease, in his element. By the same logic, in the world of martial arts, strength was the main argument in any dispute. The boy grinned and realized that to strengthen his authority, he only needed to defeat this young older brother in a fair fight. The boy loudly greeted his older brother Myung-sung, beginning his formal address. Hui-young suggested a friendly sparring match to celebrate their new acquaintance. Chunghwa interrupted him, pointing out that without knowledge of Taiji Chuan, the basis of udon, the duel was impossible. The teacher remarked that Myung-kyung would be able to teach him the basic movements of Tai Chi Chuan. Myung-gyun asked in surprise if he had truly been entrusted with this task. Chunghwa sternly ordered him to train the newcomer, and Myung-gyun's eyes lit up with delight. The boy exclaimed joyfully, accepting his mentor's offer. Soon the boy's hands were describing smooth circles, enveloped in a bluish glow of internal energy. He took a low stance with one arm raised above his head, trying to master the form. The legs were spread wide, the back tense in an attempt to maintain balance. Myung-gyung watched his clumsy efforts from the sidelines in bewilderment. Myung-gyung complained that he had tried his best to teach him the basics. Kneeling next to him, the other Myung admitted that he had indeed tried. Myung-gyun remarked that success depends on the student, although Tai Chi is the absolute foundation. The young man countered that he too had given it his all, trying to master the movements. Myung-gyun tried to straighten his arms, but the boy groaned that his body was going numb. The guy mentally compared it to how he mastered the three-element sword style. Talent boards popped up. Physique for 2 liang, speed and martial arts for 100. But Tai Chi wasn't on them, and he had no money to buy the one he needed. He was broke. Myung-jin and Myung-kyung looked at each other, and Myung-jin remarked that this didn't make sense. Myung-jin suggested that the boy might simply not want to study with them. Myung-gyun countered that this was not the case, and called Hui-young a good person. The boy got into a fighting stance, clenching his fists, while the brothers watched. The boy loudly exclaimed that of course he wanted to learn from his elders. He declared that he wanted to study on his own for a while, so as not to waste their time. Myung-jin doubted whether training alone would help, but Myung-gyun agreed with his reasoning. The boy despairingly wondered how these young men even perceived him. Chunghwa appeared on the scene, and firmly said that this was enough. The master noticed that the younger one was learning slowly, and with a sigh admitted that he had realized this already on the Sword of the Three Elements, and now he'll take over the training himself. The boy tried to stop his mentor, shouting for him to wait a second. He wondered, who said you couldn't make money on Mount Udon? Hui-young defiantly declared that he was different and capable of more. The boy turned to his mentor, saying he had an important announcement to make before continuing. Chunghwa, surprised, asked what he wanted to say. The boy smiled and confidently raised a finger, announcing his desire to leave the mountain. He added that he was now officially a lay disciple. Chunghwa chuckled thoughtfully as he looked around at the majestic buildings of Udon. The boy looked at his mentor with hope, waiting for his answer, and asked the mentor in bewilderment why he was looking at him with such an expression. The young man responded by reminding him that a lay disciple had the right to leave the mountain for business purposes. Chunghwa stated that he was well aware of his new status, but his mentor cooled his ardor. He'd only just received the title and wasn't giving him any freedom. Chunghwa sternly asked him where he was going instead of studying. The boy, slightly embarrassed, explained that he was planning to visit his father. The mentor asked in surprise, "Is he really going to see his father?" Gigi declared this status a source of pride. Chunghwa remarked that delivering such joyful news by letter rather than in person was simply shameful. The mentor lowered his head with a sigh, considering his student's request, and his face expressed slight fatigue. Chunghwa agreed, but set a condition. The boy objected, saying he was only going away for a short time and didn't understand the need for new demands. The mentor explained that he had a premonition that without supervision, Hui Young would definitely give up training. He firmly demanded that his older brother be sent with him to oversee the situation. Xianghua snapped at him. He wouldn't leave the mountain without this condition. The boy readily agreed and asked easily if that was all that was required of him. Xianghua confirmed that that was the condition, and now the only question was when he was going to descend. Hui Young thought for a moment and replied that he planned to set out in a few days, not tomorrow. He explained that he needed some time to prepare for the descent and pack his things. Xianghua narrowed his eyes slightly as he glanced at the boy. He smiled, thinking how glad he would be to see his father. Hui Young added silently that he couldn't appear before his parents without gifts. After some time, a large schoolyard was visible against the backdrop of majestic mountains. Our rich guys we knew, dressed in dark clothes, were sitting on the stairs. Hui Young walked up and greeted them loudly and was surprised that they were there. Standing by the stone ball, the old friend with a blade of grass in his mouth noted with a grin that they had not seen each other for a long time. He asked with a smile if Hui Young had really become an official student, and ironically asked if he would now abandon the ordinary guise. The guy shrugged and replied that his status was almost no different from theirs, except that he was studying more powerful techniques. Osu chuckled and remarked that this was a real special relationship, and other lay disciples would be dying to get close to him. Hui Young remembered that people used to crowd around him, but as soon as he asked for a loan, they would all disappear in an instant. Osu, with a sly smile, noted that lending money was a completely different story, and here he was powerless. And then he raised an eyebrow in surprise and thought, isn't that why he's here? To ask for help? Hui Young smiled and asked directly if those guys could lend him some money. Climbing the stairs, Hong Yan asked how much money he needed. The boy replied with a smile that the more the better, he'd take whatever they gave him. Standing on the stone steps, Hong Yang suddenly asked if it was true that Hui Young had become Chenghua's own disciple. The guy confirmed that he had just come from his mentor, and this was indeed true. Hong Yan chuckled in surprise and asked again if this was true, his voice betraying curiosity. It was then that the protagonist discovered some pressure from his old friends. Hui Young caught their gaze and reminded them that Zheng Su and Yo Hong Yang needed to know about this. The boy narrowed his eyes, remembering they knew about his status. The acquaintance explained that his connections with Udong were important, and Hui Young could charge any price. After some time, Osu breathed a sigh of relief and agreed to lend him some money, but he warned that the amount would be modest. He explained that although he is the son of the head of a Wuhan exchange office, that title doesn't give him much wealth. The guy asked how much exactly he could give, and in response, he heard the sum of 500 silver liang. Throwing up his hands, Hui Young's eyes widened. That amount of money would have been enough for a family of 4 to last 3 years. He was indignant at how anyone could call it a small sum. Hong Yan calmly replied that it was nothing to him, and sincerely didn't understand the outrage. Having mastered his emotions, the young man asked how much he would receive in total. And then his friend, with a grin, named a figure of about 2,000 silver liang, and Hui Young mentally digested this amount. Hui Young, knowing about his background, was surprised that he was able to get such money without even asking his father's permission. He added that if he told his father, he would probably give him even more. Standing on the stairs, his acquaintance suggested with a grin that they do just that. However, he abruptly refused, explaining that then Hui Young would become just another of his father's connections. The guy hotly objected that he needed his own personal connection, not someone else's protection. Hong Yan narrowed his eyes meaningfully and asked if Gigi understood what he was talking about. With a satisfied smile, the young man confirmed the deal was done. He silently noted that his blood was right, feeling a rare grip for someone his age. Hui Young smiled. It was a great deal for him, even though he was a child with much to learn. 2 receipts for 500 tael, each with his personal seals, landed on the table. Several days passed, and a majestic mountain landscape with traditional udon buildings spread out before the travelers. The boy, folding his hands in a respectful gesture, declared that during this journey he would be entirely in the care of his older brother. He formally addressed his companion, calling him his elder martial arts brother, Myung Kyung. Junior warned that leaving the sect was no reason to relax. Training would continue. Gigi chuckled. Cheng-hua sent the perfect dog. Despite this, Hui Young stepped forward cheerfully, proposing to set out first and then work out the details. The goal was Wuhan, and the journey ahead was long. Myung Kyung asked in surprise if his father lived there, waiting for confirmation. The guy was a little embarrassed and replied that it wasn't exactly like that, but he had some business there. He added that everything would become clearer once they got there, without going into details. From above, a view opened up of a wide block of houses and shops. The boy walked along the dusty street, dragging a huge bundle of things on his back, and his younger companion trudged along next to him. Myung-kyung, turning his head, asked hopefully if this was Wuhan already, and his eyes lit up. Hui-young shook his head and replied that it was Shangyang City and that they should first hire horses for the long journey. The boy began counting the money in his bag, wondering if it would be enough to rent 2 horses. Myung-kyung asked in amazement if they were really planning to ride. Myung-kyung categorically stated that horse riding was absolutely out of the question, and his decision was firm. He pointed out that if they rode horses, they would not be able to train and develop skills at all. The boy tried to object, but Myung-kyung explained that walking builds the technique of lightness. The boy sighed. Farewell, easy travel. Hui-young had to admit that his older brother's idea did make sense and was even useful. However, the guy then abruptly changed the subject and suggested having a snack first to gain strength before going out. He pointed his finger towards the restaurants, hoping that Myung-kyung would agree to a short break. Myung-kyung looked at him in bewilderment and wondered if he really wanted to eat right now and right here. The guy assured with a smile that it was a famous establishment and that his older brother would definitely like it there. However, a moment later, the little boy bumped into something big and hard. A huge guy stood in front of the restaurant doors, looking at them with an appraising gaze. The shopkeeper, looking at their modest clothes, said doubtfully that even the cheapest noodles cost 100 copper coins. He asked them point blank if they had any money at all to pay for such an expensive lunch,